Welcome to ScareZone. Tonight we bring you hours of true horror stories to help you relax, sleep, or simply enjoy the atmosphere. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. Now, close your eyes and let the rain begin.
Julian arrived at Graymore Manor 4 hours early, which was the entire point. The late autumn afternoon light came through the broken windows at angles that made no sense. Too flat, too gray, falling on floors that seemed to tilt when he looked away. The house sat before him exactly as memory insisted it should. 3 stories of rotting Georgian architecture, white paint peeled to gray wood, windows dark even in daylight. He found the coal chute half hidden by dead ivy, its metal door rusted open at an angle that suggested violence. The smell coming up was wrong, not decay, sharper. Ammonia, and something underneath that coated the back of his throat. He lowered himself through feet first. The drop was longer than it should have been. His sneakers hit concrete in absolute darkness, and for a moment his lungs locked. The closet. Age 7. His brother's hand on the outside of the door, the lock clicking, the dark pressing against his face like wet cloth. He forced himself to breathe, pulled out his flashlight. The beam caught dust particles hanging motionless in air that should have been moving. The coal cellar opened into a low stone corridor he didn't remember from the building plans. He had to crouch to move forward, his backpack scraping the ceiling, walls close enough that his elbows brushed them with each step. The servants' passages ran through the entire house. That was the beauty of it. While Grant and Clara wandered the main rooms, he'd be behind the walls, tapping on pipes, whispering through vents. By midnight, they'd be climbing over each other to escape. Grant's $100 bet would buy a very nice dinner. He found the first access panel behind the kitchen. The wood was swollen but gave when he shouldered it. The passage beyond was barely 2 feet across, forcing him sideways. His flashlight reached maybe 6 feet before darkness swallowed it. The thermos of hot cider tasted off when he drank it. Slightly bitter beneath the cinnamon, but thermoses always made things taste like metal. He took 3 long swallows. It would be a cold night. The passage curved left, following the exterior wall. 12 steps to the corner, then right. Another 15 to what should have been the dining room. And when he pressed his ear to the wall, listening for the hollow sound that would indicate a panel, he heard breathing instead. Not his breathing. Something behind the wall he was leaning against. The wall that should have been the exterior of the house. He stepped back, put his hand flat against the plaster. It was warm. He moved forward, trailing his left hand along the wall for balance. His fingers found something carved into the plaster. Letters. Julian was here 1994. His own handwriting. He was certain. But he hadn't brought anything to write with, hadn't been inside the passages yet. The flashlight flickered. Died. Came back on with a color that was slightly wrong, more yellow like candlelight. He turned back toward the kitchen panel. The passage behind him had changed. It was longer now, stretching into darkness his light couldn't reach, and the walls on either side curved inward like a throat. His hands shook when he checked his watch. The crystal was fogged from the inside, hands frozen at 4:52, but he'd entered at 3:30, and that had been maybe 20 minutes ago. The breathing came again, closer. Behind him and ahead of him, and possibly inside the walls on both sides, he needed to get out. Back to the coal cellar, up through the chute. He could return at 7 with the others, pretend he'd just arrived. But when he turned, the passage was gone. The wall behind him was solid plaster, marked with that same carved message. Julian was here 1994, repeated in rows, climbing toward a ceiling he could no longer see. The cider had definitely tasted wrong. His stomach felt loose, disconnected. The flashlight beam kept sliding off surfaces before he could identify them. When he looked at his hands, they seemed to leave trails in the air, ghost hands overlapping his real hands in sequence. He pressed forward. Had to be a panel somewhere ahead. The passage narrowed. He had to exhale to squeeze through, his chest scraping the wall in front. He shrugged out of his backpack, left it, kept moving. The darkness ahead began to pulse like something breathing, and now he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the walls, except it wasn't synced with his actual heartbeat, creating a rhythm that made his teeth ache. The panel appeared without warning. One moment blank wall, the next a seam, a handle, a rectangle of lesser darkness. He grabbed the handle, cold enough to burn, and pulled. The panel opened into the main parlor. He recognized the massive fireplace, the water-stained wallpaper, the Victorian settee with horsehair stuffing erupting through cracked leather. And he recognized Grant's fishing line, nearly invisible, running from the settee to a mahogany bookcase that towered against the far wall. He saw the line, saw it clearly. Even with his vision swimming and doubling, he saw the trap. He stepped over it. His foot caught on a second line he hadn't seen, pulled taut at ankle height, and the sound that followed was enormous. Wood shrieking, plaster cracking, the bookcase's top shelf hitting the floor with a percussion that stopped his heart. The bookcase had missed him. He'd stumbled forward with his depth perception destroyed by whatever Clara had put in the cider. It had to be Clara. Grant wasn't that subtle. But it hit his left hand, pinning it against the floor with an entire shelf of waterlogged encyclopedias. The pain was distant at first, far away before it arrived in full, and he heard himself make a sound he'd never made before. He pulled. The hand didn't move. When he tried to brace his feet, the floor tilted sideways, dumped him onto his back. The ceiling above him was rotating, the plaster rosette spinning counterclockwise, while the light fixture stayed perfectly still. His trapped hand had started to go cold. He managed to sit up, braced his right hand against the bookcase, and pushed. It shifted maybe an inch before settling back. The encyclopedias were swollen with moisture, twice their normal weight. Volume F through L had landed, spine down on his knuckles. He could see the impression they were making in his skin, could see his fingers at angles that fingers shouldn't achieve. Someone was coming down the main staircase. Footsteps, casual and unhurried, accompanied by a low whistle he almost recognized. The tune bent in the middle, slid sideways into harmonies that shouldn't exist. He called out, but his voice came out wrong. Too high, too uncertain. The whistling stopped. The footsteps continued. He grabbed the bookcase with his free hand and pulled with everything he had. The shelf lifted maybe 2 inches. His trapped hand was completely numb now, which was worse than the pain. He couldn't tell if he was actually moving it. The whistling started again directly behind him. He twisted to look. The servant's panel he'd come through was closed. Had he closed it? The handle was turning from the inside slowly, metal squeaking with each increment. His voice bounced wrong off the walls when he tried to speak. Came back as someone else's voice, deeper and older. The handle stopped turning. The panel stayed closed. The footsteps on the stairs had reached the landing. He could see the staircase through the parlor doorway. Wide oak steps, carved banister, the slashed oil painting of a woman in Victorian dress. No one was on the stairs. The footsteps kept coming anyway. He got his feet under him, pulled. The bookcase tilted, and his hand came free with a sensation like tearing cloth. He didn't look at it. Instead, he staggered toward the main entrance hall, his left arm cradled against his chest. The front door was 15 feet away, solid oak with a brass handle. He could see his car through the side windows, his gray Honda Civic, parked at an angle near the overgrown boxwoods. The door was locked. He'd left it unlocked. Was certain. had specifically checked it before climbing through the coal chute because his keys were in his backpack, which was somewhere in the walls behind him. He tried the handle anyway. It didn't turn. Behind him, the whistling grew louder, splitting into harmony with itself, two voices whistling two different songs that somehow fit together. The servants' passages. He could get back into them, navigate to the coal chute, climb out. His left hand was useless, but he could manage one-handed. He turned back toward the parlor. The panel was open now, and darkness beyond it, so complete it looked solid, and something was stepping through. It was Grant. Except Grant was 7 feet tall, and Grant's arms hung to his knees, and Grant's face was divided vertically down the middle, the left half normal and grinning, the right half nothing but exposed skull with teeth that went back too far. The words came from the walls, not from the thing's mouth. Something about his hand, something about crushed spiders. Julian looked down. His hand was fine, was completely normal. He looked up. Grant was gone. The panel was closed. He was standing in the entrance hall with his back to the front door, and someone was knocking on it from outside. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that rattled the frame. He spun, pressed his face to the side window. His car was still there, but now there was a second car beside it. Clara's white Volvo, which meant she'd arrived early too, which meant she knew someone was already inside. The knocking came again, same rhythm. But now it was behind him, from deeper in the house. He moved back toward the parlor. The room was empty except for the fallen bookcase and overturned encyclopedias. His blood on the floor was black, spreading too slowly, more like oil than liquid. The whistling started again everywhere at once. The servants' panel was open, waiting. He approached slowly. The passage beyond was different. Wider, brighter walls painted fresh white. There was a light source deeper in, yellow and flickering, and he could hear voices. Clara's voice, Grant's voice, his own voice, all 3 talking over each other. He stepped through. The passage closed behind him with a sound like a door slamming underwater. The voices cut off. He was in the coal cellar again. The narrow stone corridor with motionless dust. But now there were footprints in the dust. His footprints, leading away from where he stood and also toward him from the opposite direction, meeting in the middle. He followed the footprints that led away, and they took him to a door he didn't remember. Wooden, with a brass handle identical to the front doors. Beyond it, he could hear the whistling. He tried the handle. It turned easily. The room on the other side was the parlor again, or a version of it. The bookcase stood intact against the wall, no fishing line, no encyclopedias on the floor. The settee's leather was pristine. The wallpaper looked freshly hung, and standing in the center of the room, looking at something on the floor, was himself. The other Julian bent down, picked up something that glinted. A flashlight. His flashlight. Julian tried to speak. His throat was too dry, tried to step forward. His feet had become very heavy. The other Julian straightened, turned, looked directly at him with eyes that were completely black, pupil and iris and white all swallowed by darkness. The words echoed through everything. You never left. You never left. You never left. Julian slammed the door shut, stood with his back against it, heart hammering. The cider. Clara had put something in the cider. This was all the cider, just a bad trip, just his brain misfiring. The door began to bulge outward against his back. Not opening. Bulging. The wood stretching like rubber. Something pressing against it with enormous force. He ran. Grant arrived exactly on time, which was the point of having a watch with a second hand. 7 p.m. He pulled his truck beside Julian's Civic and sat for a moment. The house looked exactly like the photos, maybe more decayed, the porch sagging steeper. Clara's Volvo sat on the other side of Julian's car, still ticking as the engine cooled. So everyone was early. Of course, that was how competitions worked when competitors actually gave a damn. He grabbed his duffel bag and climbed out. The night air had a bite that meant frost by morning. Good. The colder they were, the more eager they'd be to flee once his prop started working. The preparations had taken 3 days. He'd come Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, always after dark, always parking a quarter-mile away and hiking through the woods. The fishing line was monofilament, nearly invisible. He'd strung it through every doorway, parlor, dining hall, library, and attached the ends to furniture chosen for maximum dramatic effect. A full-length mirror, the chandelier, the mahogany bookcase that probably weighed 300 pounds. The trick was in the angles. Let them walk through normally once, twice. The third time, when they weren't paying attention, the line would catch their ankle and boom. The front door was unlocked. Julian had beat him here by maybe 5 minutes based on engine temperature. Clara had arrived 3 minutes ago. He pushed the door open. The entrance hall smelled like standing water and something else, something rotten. It made him think of the bucket of fish guts his father kept behind the garage for fertilizer. He called out for them. His voice disappeared into the house without echo. The acoustics were wrong, flat. He tried again, louder, letting them know he'd seen their cars. Nothing, that was fine. Expected. They were probably positioning themselves, ready to jump out. He moved into the parlor. The room was in worse shape than he remembered. The wallpaper had separated from the walls in long strips, curling toward the floor. The floorboards near the fireplace had warped upward like a ship's deck. The settee was darker than it should have been. He stepped closer, pulling out his flashlight. The leather was wet, fresh wet, and the wet was red. Not red like paint. Red like the deer his father had gutted last November. He put his hand on the Eote's back for balance. His palm came away sticky. He said Julian's name again, harder this time. Said it wasn't funny. The main staircase was visible through the parlor doorway. He could see scuff marks on the steps, fresh scuff marks. And there on the third step from the bottom was a handprint, palm down. 4 fingers splayed, red. He climbed carefully, testing each step. The 10th step gave slightly under his foot, with a creaking that seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the walls. The landing branched into 2 hallways. The east wing was darker. Most windows boarded over, but he could see something at the far end, a shape standing motionless against the window, silhouetted. He called out Clara's name. The shape didn't move. Grant started down the hallway, flashlight bouncing with each step. The shape at the end was too tall to be Clara, too tall to be Julian. As he got closer, he could see it was a coat rack, one of those Victorian standing models. Someone had draped a tarp or blanket over it. He pulled the cloth off. Beneath was nothing, just the coat rack's wooden frame, empty hooks. But the cloth itself was heavy. When he turned it over, he realized it wasn't a tarp. It was a coat. A woman's coat, gray wool, styled in a way that hadn't been fashionable since before he was born. The pockets were full of something. He reached into the right pocket and pulled out a handful of teeth. Human teeth. Molars mostly, but some incisors, some canines, all brown with decay. He dropped the coat, wiped his hand on his jeans. The teeth scattered across the floor with small clicking sounds, and one rolled away down the hallway, picking up speed as the 4's angle carried it toward the stairs. He acknowledged it out loud. Very good. Great prop work. But he wasn't leaving. The hallway behind him had changed. The doorways were in different positions. He'd passed 3 rooms on his way to the coat rack. But now there were 5 doorways on the left side and none on the right. His truck keys were in his front pocket. His phone was in his back pocket. He could walk out right now, drive away. Come back tomorrow with a camera. Prove he'd figured out the prank and won by default. But that was exactly what they wanted. He moved back toward the stairs. The coat rack was in front of him again, though he hadn't turned around. The coat was draped over it exactly as he'd found it the first time. He grabbed the cloth and pulled. The coat rack tipped toward him and something fell out from inside. A speaker, small and black, still playing a sound he hadn't noticed until it stopped. A recording of breathing, his own breathing. The exact rhythm, played back with a fraction of a second delay. He stomped on the speaker. The plastic cracked. The breathing stopped. Another point to Julian. Very clever. But he still wasn't leaving. The staircase was closer than it should have been. He'd walked maybe 15 feet down the hallway, but now the stairs were directly beside him. He descended carefully, watching for his fishing line. The monofilament should have been strung across the landing. He tied it himself, threading it through eye hooks screwed into the baseboards. But the line was gone. The eye hooks were still there, empty, the monofilament cut cleanly. Someone had disarmed his traps, had found every single line. That should have made him angry. Instead, it made his hands shake. The parlor was different. The bookcase was on its side now, encyclopedias scattered. And there was something underneath. Something that looked like a hand, palm up, fingers at the wrong angle. He approached slowly. The hand was real. Was attached to an arm. Was attached to a body the bookcase had crushed from mid-torso upward. The visible parts were wearing Julian's clothes. Julian's jacket. Julian's sneakers. Wait, that was yesterday. Yesterday, Grant had seen Julian at the diner. Today was... what day was it? He pulled out his phone. The screen showed October 31st, 1994. The time, 7:23 p.m. But his watch said 7:18. And yesterday had been the 29th, which meant today should be the 30th, which meant tomorrow should be Halloween, not today. The body under the bookcase shifted. The visible hand twitched. Fingers curled into a fist. Grant ran. He hit the front door at full speed, grabbed the handle, pulled. The door was locked. He yanked harder, and the handle came off in his hand, just separated from the door with a grinding sound, leaving a square hole. Through the hole, he could see outside. His truck was gone. Clara's Volvo was gone. Julian's Civic was still there, but now it was rusted. Paint faded to primer. Windshield so covered with leaves and bird droppings, it looked like it hadn't moved in years. He put his eye to the hole. The driveway was empty. No, not empty. 3 shapes standing at the tree line, maybe 50 feet away. 2 men and a woman. They were waving at him. He stepped back. His chest was tight. The air seemed thinner than it should be. The basement. He could get to the basement, find a window, break it, climb out. The basement door was under the main staircase, built into the paneling. He'd noticed it during prep visits, but hadn't bothered. Basements were expected to be frightening. The door opened easily. Beyond it, wooden steps descended into darkness. His flashlight barely penetrated. The smell was worse. Decay and something caustic that made his sinuses burn. He started down, counted steps, 12, 13. More than there should have been. At 20, he stopped and looked back. The doorway at the top was tiny now, impossibly distant. At step 35, his flashlight died. He shook it. The bulb flickered, came back on with that wrong yellowish color, then died completely. He continued in absolute darkness, one hand on the wall, feet feeling carefully for each step. His phone was in his pocket, but he didn't want to waste the battery. The steps ended abruptly. His foot came down, expecting another tread, and found concrete. the impact jarring up through his knee. He was in a room, basement, root cellar. The smell was overwhelming. Not just that acrid sharpness. Underneath was the thick, sweet stench of meat going bad in summer heat. He pulled out his phone, used the screen's glow to orient himself. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12. Concrete walls on 3 sides, wooden shelves built into the far wall, mostly rotted, collapsed under old preserving jars. And there, on the floor beneath the shelves, was something large and dark, wrapped in a tarp. The tarp was moving, slowly, a rhythmic rising and falling. Grant backed toward the stairs. His foot hit something that rolled. Another one of those teeth, he thought wildly. His phone's glow caught something written on the concrete wall to his left, scratched deep into the surface. Grant was here in 1994. His handwriting, his exact handwriting, the way he crossed his T's with a downward hook. The thing in the tarp sat up. It didn't unfold or rise naturally. It simply moved from horizontal to vertical in one motion, no joints bending, no pause for balance. The tarp fell away. Underneath was Julian. Except Julian was wrong. His head was crushed on the left side, caved in above the ear, and the wound was fresh. Grant could see exposed bone, see blood that was still liquid. But Julian's eyes were open, were looking at him. He tried to deny it, tried to say it wasn't real. Someone had put something in the cider. Clara had done this. Julian's mouth opened. No sound came out. Instead, something crawled out from between his teeth. Something with too many legs, dark and segmented, moving across Julian's lower lip before dropping to the floor and scuttling toward Grant's feet. Grant ran for the stairs, hit them at full speed, climbed 3, 4, 5 steps before his foot went through rotted wood, plunged down into space that shouldn't exist. His leg went into the knee, broken wood tearing through his jeans, and when he tried to pull himself up, the stair above gave way too. He was stuck, leg trapped. He could feel splinters working into his calf, could feel something moving beneath the staircase, under the floor, crawling across his ankle inside his sock. He twisted, pulled. His shoe came off, but his leg stayed trapped. And now the thing from Julian's mouth was on the stairs below him, climbing toward his dangling foot, with a sound like fingernails on glass. He yanked with everything he had. The wood cracked. His leg came free, and he scrambled up the remaining stairs on his hands and knees, not caring about splinters, not caring about anything except getting up and away. He hit the basement door at full speed. It was closed. He didn't remember closing it. He grabbed the handle and pulled, and the door didn't move. It was locked from the outside. He'd pounded on it, called out to Julian and Clara, begged them to let him out, said it wasn't funny anymore. His voice sounded strange, too small, like shouting underwater. He kept pounding. His fists made no sound. The wood was solid oak, thick enough that he could pound all night, and no one would hear him 3 feet away. The temperature in the stairwell was dropping. He could see his breath now, white clouds that hung in the air without dispersing. His phone. He could call for help. His hands shook so badly he dropped it twice before getting it unlocked. No signal. He held it up, trying different heights, different angles. Nothing. The cold was becoming painful. His exposed skin burned. His breath came in short gasps that turned to ice crystals. He needed to get back down to the basement. There had to be a window, something he'd missed, but the thing that looked like Julian was down there. And the thing from Julian's mouth was down there. And the tarp was down there, moving. He sat down on the top step. His teeth were chattering. He'd wait for morning. When sunlight came through the door's crack, someone would see it, would realize he was trapped, would let him out. The cold settled over him like a blanket made of knives. Clara had noticed something wrong with the cider 15 minutes after drinking it. but she'd assumed Julian had cheaped out on spices again. Now, standing in the entrance hall while the walls breathed in and out like lung tissue, she understood she'd made a significant miscalculation. The datura should have produced mild visual distortions, slight paranoia, some difficulty with depth perception. She'd measured the dose carefully. 12 seeds ground fine and mixed into the thermos Julian always brought. Enough to make them see shadows move, hear whispers. Not enough for this. The front door was melting. The oak panels were running down like candle wax, pooling on the floor in liquid wood that smoked and bubbled. She could see through the melted sections to outside, where her Volvo sat next to Julian's Civic, both cars normal. She closed her eyes, counted to 10, opened them. The door was solid again. But now there was a woman standing in front of it. The woman wore a gray wool coat Clara recognized from the Historical Society's archives, Victorian era, probably 1890s. The woman's face was wrong, features too symmetrical, skin too smooth, like a department store mannequin. Clara told herself the woman wasn't real, just a datura hallucination. Would go away in a few hours. The woman smiled. Her teeth were all molars, just molars, packed into her mouth in rows that went back too far. Clara turned away. The parlor was to her left. She could hear something, a rhythmic creaking, like someone rocking in a chair, or like a tree branch moving in wind. Except there was no wind. The house was perfectly still, the air so motionless it felt solid. She entered the parlor. The bookcase was on its side, encyclopedias scattered, and there was definitely something underneath, something that had been crushed. The smell was extraordinary, not decay, but the smell of crushed internal organs, the specific iron and bile scent of a body cavity torn open. She'd been pre-med her first year. She knew that smell. Julian's face was visible beneath volume F through L. His eyes were open. They tracked her movement as she approached. She tried to speak to him calmly, tried to ask if he was real. Her voice was too calm. That was the datura. It suppressed the amygdala's fear response. Julian didn't answer, couldn't answer. His chest wasn't moving, but his eyes were still tracking her. She needed to find Grant. Grant would be somewhere in the house, setting up traps, convinced he was going to win. Grant would have his truck keys. Grant would drive her to the emergency room where they could give her activated charcoal and benzodiazepines. She left the parlor, took the main staircase up, moving carefully because her depth perception was compromised. The steps seemed to shift position between her looking at them and her feet landing on them. Halfway up, she saw the marks, fresh scuff marks, and oil. Someone had spread oil on the steps, dark and slick, reflecting her phone's flashlight in rainbows. Grant. This was exactly his style. Crude, physical, designed to make you fall. She stepped over the oil slick, made it to the landing without incident. The east wing hallway stretched away too long, doorways on both sides at intervals that didn't match the exterior architecture. A sound came from the far end, whistling. The same tune her father used to whistle while working in the garage, except the melody kept bending sideways into notes that didn't exist. She started down the hallway, called out to Grant, said this was a bad time for pranks, said she needed him to drive her to the hospital. The whistling stopped. A door opened on her left. Not one of the doors she could see. This one appeared in the wall between two existing doorways, materializing like a photograph developing. Beyond it was darkness, and that smell again, the iron and bile smell. She kept walking. The door closed behind her without her touching it. Another door opened ahead. On the right, through it she could see Grant standing in what looked like a library, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. She called his name. He didn't turn around. She entered the library. The room was smaller than it should be, shelves packed with books whose spines were blank. Grant was standing in the center, but now she could see he wasn't shaking. He was vibrating, his whole body oscillating at a frequency just barely visible. She asked for his truck keys. He turned around. His face was blue. Not pale. Actually blue, the color of a drowned body, after 3 days in cold water. His lips were black. His eyes were white, the pupils completely contracted or completely absent. He spoke, but his voice was wrong, too deep. Something about the basement, something about the cold. She told herself he wasn't real. Grant was setting up traps somewhere. This was her visual cortex misfiring. The thing that looked like Grant smiled. His teeth were all molars. She turned and left the library. The hallway behind her was different. All doorways on the left side, none on the right, and the windows at the far end showed daylight instead of night. Bright afternoon sun that made no sense. She needed to find the basement. If Grant was there, if he was actually cold like the hallucination suggested, she could help him. Get him outside, get him warm. The datura would wear off eventually. 6 hours, 8 at most. She just had to ride it out, stay calm, distinguish between what was real and what her compromised neurotransmitters were generating. The basement door was under the main staircase. She found it on her 3rd try. The house kept rearranging itself, but the staircase stayed constant, and the door beneath it finally appeared when she stopped looking directly at it. The door was cold when she touched it. Cold enough that her palm stuck slightly. She opened it. The darkness beyond was absolute. Her phone's flashlight carved out a cone of visibility that ended after about 6 feet, as if the basement was full of smoke. She called down for Grant. No answer. But she could hear something. A rhythmic sound. Breathing, she thought at first. Then realized it was too slow for breathing. Too measured. She started down the stairs, counted them. 12. The number that was supposed to be there. The stairs ended at a concrete floor. The room she was standing in was too small, maybe 6 by 6. 3 concrete walls, 1 wooden wall that was old shelving, mostly collapsed. No windows, no other exits, and no Grant. But there was a message scratched into the concrete floor right where she was standing. Clara was here in 1994. Her handwriting, she was absolutely certain. The way she did her R's with a little hook at the bottom. The breathing sound was behind her. She turned. The woman in the gray coat was standing on the stairs, closer now. Close enough that Clara could see her face properly, could see that the features weren't just symmetrical, they were identical. The left half and right half were perfect mirrors, and that wasn't how human faces worked. Faces were always asymmetrical. She tried to deny it again, but her voice shook. The woman's mouth opened. Her jaw unhinged like a snake's, and she started to laugh. A sound that wasn't sound, that bypassed Clara's ears and appeared directly inside her skull. Clara ran. She hit the stairs at full speed, pushed past the woman, who might have been solid or might have been nothing. Took the steps 3 at a time. Burst through the basement door into the entrance hall where Julian's face was watching her from the parlor doorway. She needed to leave. The bet didn't matter. The $100 didn't matter. Grant could win by default. The front door was locked. She tried the handle. It turned, but the door didn't open. She put her shoulder into it. The wood didn't budge. Windows. She'd break a window. The parlor had the largest windows. She grabbed a piece of the fallen bookcase, a wooden shelf maybe 3 feet long, and swung it at the nearest window with everything she had. The glass didn't break. The wood in her hands did. Split right down the middle with a crack like a gunshot, and the shock traveled up her arms into her shoulders. She tried again with a different piece. Same result. The wood shattered. The glass was unmarked. The oil on the stairs. She could still smell it. Motor oil, the kind Grant used. If she could just get up the stairs without slipping, find a second-story window, break it from the outside edge where the glass would be thinner. She was halfway up when her foot hit the slick section. Her ankle rolled. Her center of gravity shifted too far forward. She grabbed for the banister, but her hand was sweaty and slipped. And then she was falling backward, tumbling, the stairs hitting her in sequence. Spine, skull, spine, skull, the carved edges catching on her clothes and skin. She landed at the bottom in a position that hurt in a way that made no sense. Her neck was at an angle, a bad angle. She tried to move and couldn't. Tried to breathe and found that breathing had become optional. Something happening somewhere else to someone else. The woman in the gray coat was standing over her now, kneeling down, reaching out to touch Clara's face with the hands that were too cold, fingers pressing into her cheeks like testing fruit for ripeness. The woman spoke with Clara's mother's voice. Said it was all right. Said Clara was going to stay here now, all three of them. Said it was what they wanted, wasn't it? To win? Clara tried to speak, couldn't. Her mouth wouldn't move. Her tongue was too heavy. The woman smiled, stood, walked away up the stairs, and Clara could hear her footsteps continuing up higher than the second floor, higher than the third floor, up into the regions of the house that didn't exist. The cold was coming from the floor beneath her, or from inside her. She couldn't tell which. It spread through her back, her legs, her arms, filling her up with absence. The last thing she saw was Julian's face in the parlor doorway, watching her with eyes that didn't blink. And behind Julian, deeper in the parlor, Grant's blue face floating in the darkness like a forgotten balloon. Julian stood in the entrance hall and couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. The parlor was behind him. He should go into the parlor. He'd been meaning to go into the parlor for... how long had it been? Time moved strangely in the house. Sometimes hours passed in minutes. Sometimes minutes stretched into days. His left hand hurt. He looked down at it. The fingers were at wrong angles, crushed somehow, though he couldn't remember when that had happened. When he flexed them, they moved. Bones grinding against each other in ways that should have been impossible. Joints bending backward, the crushed flesh pulling taut and then relaxing. The movement was smooth, normal, except nothing about it was normal. There were voices somewhere in the house. Clara's voice, Grant's voice. They were arguing about something. They were always arguing about something. He moved toward the parlor doorway, stopped. Someone was lying at the bottom of the main staircase. A woman. Her neck was bent at an angle that made his stomach clench. Her red sweater was the same color as the blood that had pooled around her head, so at first he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It was Clara. He stared at her. Tried to remember when Clara had fallen. Tried to remember if he'd been there, if he'd seen it happen. The memory was there, but also not there, existing in a space he couldn't quite reach. Clara's eyes were open, were looking at him. He tried to speak her name. She didn't answer, didn't move. Her chest wasn't rising and falling the way a living chest should, but her eyes were tracking him. He heard footsteps behind him, turned. Grant was coming out of the parlor, his face wrong somehow. Blue around the lips, blue under the eyes, blue in a way that suggested cold rather than bruising. Grant asked if Julian had seen Clara. Julian pointed at the base of the stairs. Grant looked, stared for a long moment. Said that wasn't Clara. Julian said it was wearing her clothes. Grant agreed about the clothes, but insisted that wasn't Clara. Said Clara was in the basement. Had been in the basement for, he didn't know, a while. Julian said he'd just been in the basement. The basement was empty. Grant asked then where she was. They both looked at the body at the bottom of the stairs. It was definitely wearing Clara's red sweater, Clara's jeans, Clara's hiking boots. Julian said they should check on her, make sure she was okay. Grant said she was fine. She was probably setting up some elaborate psychological trap. That was her style. He started toward the kitchen, said he was going to make coffee. Julian said they didn't have coffee. Grant said sure they did. Clara went shopping yesterday. Julian started to say Clara couldn't go shopping. None of them could leave until... But he stopped. Until what? Until the bet was finished. That was it. The bet. They were competing. He was going to win. He'd been winning when he arrived, had gotten here 3 hours early, had memorized the servants' passages, had all his props perfectly positioned. Then something had gone wrong. He'd stepped through a panel into the parlor, and there had been fishing line, and then... He looked down at his left hand again. The fingers were definitely crushed. Bone visible through torn skin, knuckles flattened where the encyclopedias had landed. But when he flexed them, they obeyed. Curled into a fist, straightened. The bones moved inside the ruined flesh, like separate things, grinding and clicking. It didn't hurt anymore. That was the strangest part. It should have hurt. He called out to Grant. Grant stopped in the kitchen doorway, turned to look at him. Julian asked what day it was. Grant said Halloween, obviously. That's why they were here. The bet. Julian asked what year. Grant's face went very still, asked what Julian meant. Julian said he meant, what year was it? Grant said 1994. Said it was always 1994. Julian asked always. Grant said since they got here. Since... He trailed off. His blue face was getting bluer. Asked Julian how long they'd been here. Julian said since 7 p.m. They all arrived at 7. Grant said right, 7 p.m., and now it's... He checked his watch, stared at it. Said his watch stopped. Julian said his too. They stood in the entrance hall, Julian near the parlor doorway, Grant near the kitchen doorway, Clara's body at the bottom of the stairs between them. The house was very quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like waiting. Julian said they should go, both of them. Right now. They should leave. Grant said that meant Julian forfeited. Julian said he didn't care. Grant said Julian always cared. That was his whole thing, winning. Julian said he didn't care about winning anymore. He just wanted to leave. Grant looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded. Said okay. They'd both leave. Together. The bet was a draw. They moved toward the front door. It was maybe 15 feet away. The distance stretched as they walked, the hallway extending like taffy, but they kept moving. Eventually, they reached it. Julian grabbed the handle. It was cold enough to burn. He pulled. The door didn't open. Grant tried it, put his shoulder into it. The wood didn't budge. Julian suggested the back door. They moved through the house. The kitchen door was locked. The library windows wouldn't break. The second-story windows wouldn't break. Every exit they tried was sealed, and after a while Julian realized they were moving in circles, passing the same rooms over and over, finding new variations each time, but never finding a way out. Eventually, they ended up back in the entrance hall. Clara was sitting up now. Her neck was still at that wrong angle, her head tilted too far to the left, but she was moving, was standing, was walking toward them with a gait that suggested bones that no longer quite fit together. She asked where they'd gone, said she'd been looking everywhere. Julian asked carefully if she knew what happened to her. She asked what he meant. He said she fell down the stairs. She said no, she didn't. She'd been in the library. She found something interesting. Asked if they wanted to see. Julian started to say something about her neck. She asked what about her neck. Julian couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't find words for what was wrong with Clara's neck. with her posture, with the way she moved like something operating a body from the inside rather than being a body. Grant was backing away. Said this wasn't Clara. Clara asked. Of course it was her. Who else would it be? She smiled. Her teeth looked normal. Her face looked normal. Everything looked normal except for the angle of her head, which his mind kept trying to correct, kept trying to see as fine even though it clearly wasn't. Julian said they needed to leave, all three of them. Right now. Clara asked why. They just got here. The bet just started. Julian said the bet was over. They were calling it a draw. Clara said not to be ridiculous. They couldn't call it a draw. Someone had to win. She moved closer. Said she'd been very patient. She'd been waiting for them both to realize. But they kept trying to leave. They kept trying to quit. Grant's voice was shaking. Asked, realize what? Clara said that they lost. They both lost. They lost the moment they walked through the door. The moment they decided to compete. Said the house was waiting for that. Said the house loves competition. Feeds on it. Julian felt his crushed hand throbbing. Looked down. The fingers were bent at angles that were becoming more wrong, more impossible. The bones shifting under the skin, like something was rearranging them from the inside. But they still moved when he told them to. Still curled and straightened on command. Dead flesh that refused to stay dead. He said they didn't lose. They were still here. Still competing. Clara said exactly. They were still here. They'd always be here. That was the whole point. The parlor doorway behind her was changing. Growing darker. The darkness was spreading across the floor like spilled ink. And in the darkness were shapes moving. Julian could see himself in there. Saw himself crushed under the bookcase, his head at wrong angles, his eyes still open and still tracking movement. Could see Grant in there, too. Grant blue with cold, Grant's lips black, Grant's body vibrating at a frequency that suggested something fundamental was broken. And he could see Clara. Saw her tumbling down the stairs in slow motion, over and over. Her neck snapping with a sound like green wood breaking, her eyes going wide with surprise, and then wider with realization, and then wider still as understanding dawned that she was dead, had been dead, would always be dead. Julian tried to deny it, said it wasn't real, just the datura. Clara put something in the cider. Clara agreed. Said she put something in the cider, but that wore off hours ago, days ago, years ago. Said he wasn't hallucinating anymore. This was real. This was what was left. Grant was shaking his head. Said he was going back to the basement. There had to be a window in the basement. He'd break it. Get them out. Clara said gently that he'd tried that already, 100 times. Said he always ended up on the stairs with his leg trapped and the cold settling in, and the thing from Julian's mouth climbing toward him. And then he waited for morning, and morning came. And he was still there, and he was still cold. Grant's voice cracked. Told her to stop talking. Clara asked why. Because it was true. Because he was starting to remember. She turned to Julian. Asked if he remembered. Said he remembered being in the walls, being stuck in the walls. The passages getting narrower and narrower until he had to crawl, and then even crawling didn't work anymore. And he just stayed there in the dark with the breathing sounds all around him and his own heartbeat echoing back wrong, and the cider making everything slide sideways until he couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. Julian did remember. Remembered all of it. Remembered dying in the parlor with the bookcase on top of him. Remembered watching himself die from somewhere else. Remembered standing up even though standing up should have been impossible, with his spine crushed and his ribs driven to his lungs. He said they were here now. They were talking. They were moving. Clara said of course they were moving. They were competing. They never stopped competing. Said that's what the house wanted. what it always wanted. People so obsessed with winning they wouldn't stop even after death. People who'd stay forever, trying to outlast each other, feeding it with their terrible ambition. Grant said they'd just stop then. Stop competing. Walk out together, right now. Julian said they tried that. Just tried that. The door wouldn't open. Grant said they'd try again. They'd keep trying until... Clara asked until what? Until the house let them go? Why would it do that? She moved toward the parlor, said the house won. The house always wins. Because the house is patient. The house can wait forever. And they weren't really them anymore, were they? Just the parts of them that couldn't let go. The parts that had to keep competing. The parts that valued winning over living. She disappeared into the parlor, into the darkness where the shapes were moving. Julian and Grant stood in the entrance hall. The silence between them stretched. Grant said finally that they were dead, actually dead. Julian agreed. Grant asked for how long. Julian tried to remember, tried to count the days, the weeks, the months, tried to remember if time even worked normally in the house anymore. Said he didn't know. Grant said they scared people. He remembered scaring people, urban explorers, a family. They thought they were ghosts. Julian said they were ghosts. Grant laughed. Sounded like crying. Said right. They were ghosts. And they were still competing. Even now. Even dead. Still trying to win. Julian looked at his crushed hand. At Grant's blue face. At the doorway where Clara had disappeared. Said he thought they already lost. Grant agreed. They stood there. Time passed. Or didn't pass. The house breathed around them, patient and satisfied. Eventually, Julian asked what they did now. Grant was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. The same cold that had killed him. Still present. Still spreading through whatever was left of him. Said he guessed they kept competing. Asked what else there was. Julian wanted to argue. Wanted to say they should find a way out, find a way to move on, find some way to escape the trap they'd built for themselves. But he couldn't find the words, couldn't find the energy, couldn't find anything except the old familiar hunger to win, to be better, to outlast. He said finally okay, but he wasn't cleaning the basement. That was Grant's turn. Grant said the hell it was. Julian went yesterday. Julian said that was last week. Grant said that was yesterday. Their voices rose, fell, rose again. The same argument they'd been having for hours or days or years. The same argument they would keep having forever, while the house watched and waited and fed on what was left of them. Clara's voice drifted out from the parlor announcing she was winning, just so they both knew. She'd scared away more people than either of them. Grant called back that was bullshit. He'd definitely scared away more. Julian said they were both wrong. He was winning. Grant told him to prove it. Julian told him to prove it. The argument continued. Would always continue. The house had found what it wanted. 3 people so consumed by competition, they'd literally rather die than quit. And now they had all the time in the world to keep competing, keep arguing, keep trying to outlast each other in a contest that would never end. The front door opened. All 3 of them stopped, stared. A young couple stood in the doorway. College age, maybe. The woman had a camera. The man had a flashlight. They were laughing about something. The way people laugh when they're doing something illicit and exciting. The woman was saying she'd told him it wasn't locked. This place had been abandoned for years. Julian, Grant, and Clara looked at each other. Julian claimed them first. Grant objected immediately. Clara said she already had a plan. She'd been working on a new psychological approach that would... And they were arguing as they moved toward the couple. Their voices rose, competitive and eager. The young couple froze, their laughter dying as the temperature in the entrance hall plummeted and the house began to wake up around them. The competition continued, would always continue. That was the point. That was the horror. That was the prize they'd won, and the trap they'd built, and the hell they'd chosen. The house was patient. The house was hungry. The house had all the time in the world. And so did they. Story 2. The sign stood where the paved highway surrendered to gravel and loose stone, its letters formed by an unpracticed hand that had allowed the white paint to run in places, creating the impression of melting or weeping. Pay the toll, it read, and below this command, if command it was, stood a cairn of stacked stones no higher than a man's knee, atop which rested a wooden bowl worn smooth by weather and innumerable hands. The bowl contained 3 pennies green with age, a child's plastic dinosaur, and what appeared to be a clump of human hair bound with red thread. Garrett Miller had driven 1,700 miles with a gym bag containing 2 shirts, a razor, and nothing resembling hope, and he was not about to waste even the smallest coin on superstition. The truck borrowed, though the man who'd lent it would certainly use a harsher word by now, coughed blue smoke as he accelerated past the shrine without slowing. In his rearview mirror, the sign diminished to a white smear against the darkening pines, then vanished entirely as the road curved and began its serpentine climb into the Sierra Nevadas. He had been driving since dawn, fleeing the particular variety of failure that accumulates when a man cannot hold employment, cannot hold his tongue, cannot hold anything, including the gaze of his own reflection. The road ahead promised nothing but distance, which was precisely what he required. Behind him, 3 states, 2 wives, 1 daughter who no longer returned his calls. Ahead, California's northeastern corner, where he'd heard a timber company hired without asking questions and paid in cash. Simple mathematics, simple escape. The wrongness began so subtly that he nearly mistook it for fatigue. His eyes felt gritty, as though he'd been staring at a screen too long, though he'd looked at nothing but asphalt and pines for hours. When he blinked, the moisture didn't return quite right. His eyelids seemed to catch slightly, adhering to his corneas for a fraction of a second too long before releasing. He attributed this to exhaustion and the truck's inadequate ventilation, though when he cranked the window down, the air that entered carried a peculiar thickness, almost gelatinous in quality, that seemed to coat his lungs rather than fill them. The pines crowded closer to the road than they had any right to, their lower branches scraping the truck's sides with sounds like fingernails on slate. He'd driven mountain roads before. Had driven this mountain road, in fact, 6 years earlier when everything was still salvageable, and didn't recall the forest pressing in with such aggressive intimacy. The trees themselves appeared unchanged, sugar pines and Douglas firs rising in their customary columns, their bark the expected red, brown, and gray. Yet something in their arrangement had shifted, or perhaps something in his perception of their arrangement, so that they no longer seemed to stand parallel to the road, but rather to lean inward, creating a tunnel effect that narrowed his field of vision to the illuminated cone of his headlights. When precisely had it grown dark enough to require headlights? The dashboard clock read 13 minutes before 7, and at this latitude, in mid-September, sunset shouldn't arrive for another hour. He glanced at the sky, or tried to, but found only an impenetrable ceiling of gray that rested atop the trees like a physical weight. Not clouds, exactly. The undifferentiated blankness possessed too much density for mere cloud cover, too much presence. It looked less like weather than like absence, as though something had carefully erased the sky and neglected to draw a replacement. The fog came next, though came implied movement, and this phenomenon simply manifested, achieving instant totality. One moment the road stretched visible for perhaps 50 yards in either direction. The next, the headlights illuminated only a churning wall of vapor, so thick it appeared to have mass, to possess a substance more liquid than aerial. He reduced his speed from 40 miles per hour to 30, then to 20, then to a crawl that felt dangerously slow on a mountain road's hairpin curves, yet the fog rendered greater speed suicidal. It didn't drift past the windows in wisps and streamers as normal fog would, but rather seemed to pour over the hood like water, flowing up the windshield in defiance of physics before sliding away to reveal another 10 feet of gravel. Within this fog, shapes moved. The first was an elk, or resembled an elk in the same way a child's drawing resembles the living creature. It stood at the exact boundary between road and forest, perfectly motionless except for the slow rotation of its head as the truck approached. The neck shouldn't have been able to turn that far, not without the body following, yet the head completed a full 180-degree swivel while the body remained rigidly forward-facing. In the moment before his headlights slid past, Garrett glimpsed its eyes, not the expected tapetum lucidum shine of animal eyes catching light, but something that resembled human eyes. Specifically, something that resembled the panicked white-ringed eyes of a drowning man. He told himself he'd seen a trick of fog and failing light. He told himself this with decreasing conviction as the road revealed, at irregular intervals, additional figures. A coyote whose legs bent backward at the knee joint. A black bear standing upright with its arms spread wide in a posture of crucifixion. A doe whose hide appeared to hang on its frame loosely, like an ill-fitting coat. Each animal stood at the precise boundary between road and forest, as though arranged by some unseen curator for his specific observation. Each turned to track his passage with eyes that contained entirely too much awareness, too much calculation, too much of what could only be called intention. His hands had begun to ache. The steering wheel felt slippery beneath his palms despite the truck's frigid interior, for the temperature had dropped precipitously. His breath now visible in short puffs that dissipated too quickly, as though the air itself were hungry. He flexed at his fingers, noting with distant alarm that the joints produced audible pops, sharp little detonations that reminded him unpleasantly of the sound green wood makes when split. The ache had settled deep in the bones, a sensation of cold that wouldn't respond to external heat that seemed to radiate from some interior source. The truck's engine coughed once, twice, then settled into a rough idle that suggested mechanical distress. He checked the fuel gauge, 3/4 full, eliminating the most obvious explanation, and saw that the temperature needle had drifted into the red zone despite the cold. Overheating on a mountain road in near-freezing conditions defied rational explanation, yet the gauge didn't lie. Steam began to hiss from beneath the hood, visible even through the fog, curling up in white tendrils that the headlights painted with an unhealthy yellowish cast. He nursed the truck another 1/4 mile before the engine seized with a grinding shriek that sounded like a living thing dying, almost pained. The vehicle coasted to a stop in the exact center of the road, not at the shoulder where prudence would dictate, but positioned as though some external force had decreed this specific spot appropriate for his abandonment. When he tried the ignition, it produced a single click followed by absolute silence. Even the electrical system had failed. The dashboard lights died, plunging him into darkness, alleviated only by the marginal visibility the fog grudgingly permitted. He sat for perhaps 5 minutes, breathing the strange air and listening to the engine tick as it cooled, before accepting that help would not arrive on this particular road at this particular hour. The last vehicle he'd passed had been 40 minutes ago, heading in the opposite direction. And during his ascent, he'd seen no lights, no driveways, no indication of human habitation. The nearest town, if the gas station and general store qualified as a town, lay at least 20 miles back the way he'd come, a distance that felt insurmountable in his current state, though he couldn't have articulated what precisely constituted his current state beyond the bone-deep ache and the growing conviction that his skin had become somehow looser, shifting across his frame when he moved in a manner that suggested the connections between dermis and muscle had begun to dissolve. Walking forward seemed the only option, though this conclusion arrived less through logical deduction than through a compulsion he didn't care to examine. Something about the road ahead exerted a pull, a magnetic insistence that made turning back feel not merely inadvisable, but impossible. He gathered his jacket from the passenger seat. The gym bag could remain. He owned nothing worth carrying. And stepped out into the fog. Cold struck him with physical force, a wall of frozen air that penetrated his clothing instantly and settled into his marrow. His breath emerged in great billowing clouds that the fog consumed greedily, and he found himself breathing shallowly to minimize this effect, though whether from conservation instinct or from an irrational desire to deny the fog any piece of himself, he couldn't say. The gravel crunched beneath his boots with sounds too sharp, too clear, as though the fog had somehow enhanced rather than muffled the acoustic properties of his footfalls. He'd walked perhaps 100 yards when his left knee buckled, not from fatigue, but from a failure of architecture, as though the structural integrity of the leg itself had been compromised. He caught himself before falling, but in the recovery he felt something shift inside the knee. Not bone scraping bone, not cartilage tearing, but something more fundamental. It was as though the very architecture of the joint had been questioned, found wanting, and marked for revision. When he took his next step, the knee held, but the angle felt incorrect, the leg bending at a degree his anatomy shouldn't have permitted. He looked down through the fog at his legs and saw nothing obviously wrong, yet the sensation persisted. His left leg now articulated in ways that violated the engineering of the human skeleton. The ache in his hands had spread up his arms to his shoulders, where it created a sensation of looseness, as though the ball and socket joints had acquired too much play, allowing his arms to swing in directions that should have been restricted by ligament and tendon. When he touched his face, his fingers encountered skin that felt simultaneously numb and hypersensitive, a paradoxical combination that made him jerk his hand away. The stubble on his jaw appeared to have grown longer in the past hour than should have been possible, and when he scratched at it, several hairs came away with pieces of skin still attached, tiny flecks of himself coming loose like old paint flaking from wood. Something moved in the fog to his right. Not one of the animals. Those had ceased their roadside vigil after he'd abandoned the truck, but a human figure, or something approximating human form. It kept pace with him for 20 yards, maintaining a constant distance of perhaps 15 feet, visible only as a darker density within the fog's general grayness. He stopped walking. It stopped. He resumed. It matched him step for step. Its gait seemed wrong, the rhythm of its footfalls not quite synchronizing with the movements he could barely discern through the vapor. It was as though it walked to a different tempo, following music he couldn't hear, maintaining a pace that only coincidentally aligned with his own. He tried to call out, "Hello?" or "Who's there?" or some other inadequate question. But his voice emerged wrong, the sound of it alien in his own ear, as though it had been filtered through some medium that altered not merely the volume or pitch, but the fundamental quality that identified it as his. The word fell into the fog and died without echo, absorbed so completely it might never have been spoken. The figure didn't respond unless its continued pacing constituted response. More figures appeared as he walked, each maintaining the same approximate distance, none acknowledging his presence beyond their synchronized movement. They emerged from the fog as he advanced and dissolved back into it as he passed, creating the impression of being escorted by an honor guard of shadows. He couldn't determine their number. The fog's thickness made accurate counting impossible, but felt surrounded, hemmed in by presences that had no substance yet exerted an undeniable pressure, closing around him like a fist. His breathing had grown labored despite the minimal physical exertion of walking. Each inhalation required conscious effort, as though his lungs had forgotten their autonomous function and required manual operation. The air itself seemed to have changed composition, becoming thicker, more resistant, requiring him to work harder to draw it in and even harder to expel it. He found himself gasping, then consciously controlling his breath, then gasping again when control slipped. His chest ached, not with the clean pain of exertion, but with something deeper, a sensation of hollowing, as though the cavity that contained his lungs was gradually enlarging, creating too much space, too much emptiness that his organs couldn't adequately fill. The road had begun to feel different beneath his feet. Initially, he attributed this to fatigue or to the progressive failure of his proprioception. His ability to sense his body's position had been degrading steadily, making each step uncertain, each placement of his foot approximate rather than certain. But this new sensation transcended mere sensory confusion. The gravel felt aware beneath his boots, responding to his weight, not as inert matter should respond, but with something that resembled intention. Each footfall produced not merely the expected crunch of compressed stone, but an additional sensation, a subtle give and take, as though the road itself was testing him, measuring him, assessing his substance and finding it wanting. He'd been walking for perhaps an hour, though his sense of time had grown as unreliable as his sense of physical space when he encountered the first piece of evidence. It lay half obscured by the fog at the road's edge, a backpack of the type day hikers carry, its fabric so weathered and faded that its original color had become indeterminate. He approached cautiously, though what he feared from an abandoned backpack he couldn't have articulated. When he crouched to examine it, his knees producing those alarming pops again, the sound now loud enough to make him wince, he found the pack partially unzipped, its contents partially visible. Inside, a water bottle still half full, the liquid cloudy with age or contamination. A spiral notebook whose pages had swollen with moisture, the ink bleeding into abstract patterns that obliterated whatever had been written. A wallet containing $43, a driver's license issued to one Michael Reeves of Sacramento, California, and a photograph of two young children squinting into sunshine. The license had expired 7 years ago. The children in the photograph would be teenagers now if they'd aged, if their father's disappearance hadn't frozen them in that moment of captured sunlight. Garrett straightened quickly, too quickly, and felt something in his spine crack with a sound like a tree branch snapping. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a hot wire running from his sacrum to the base of his skull, then fading to the same cold ache that had colonized his other joints. He stood very still for several seconds, afraid that movement would trigger a complete structural collapse. But when the pain receded to merely intolerable, he forced himself to continue walking, leaving Michael Reeves's belongings to their vigil at the roadside. The fog had begun to develop texture. What had initially appeared uniform now revealed layers, striations, bands of density that created the impression of depth, of dimensionality. He could see perhaps 3 distinct strata, the thick base layer that carpeted the road itself, rising to approximately waist height, a middle band of lesser density through which the shadowy figures move, and an upper layer that formed the ceiling he'd mistaken for sky. These layers moved independently, flowing at different speeds and in different directions, creating a nauseating sense of movement that made him stagger. He closed his eyes to alleviate the vertigo, then opened them quickly when closing them made it worse, when the darkness behind his lids filled with shapes that moved and whispered and suggested things he couldn't bear to contemplate. His skin had begun to feel genuinely loose, like clothing sized for someone larger. When he walked, it shifted across his frame with each step, the sensation distinct and horrifying. He could feel it bunching at his joints, gathering in folds at his elbows and knees, sagging from his face in ways that shouldn't have been possible, that violated everything he understood about the body's construction. He touched his cheek and felt the skin move independently of the bone beneath, sliding across his face like a mask poorly fitted. More artifacts appeared along the road at irregular intervals. A single hiking boot, its laces still tied, a pair of eyeglasses with one lens missing, a child's stuffed rabbit so deteriorated by weather that only the general shape remained recognizable. Each object told a story of interrupted travel, of journeys terminated at this spot for reasons the objects themselves couldn't articulate. He cataloged them mentally at first, 7 items in the first half mile, then stopped counting when the number became depressing, when the accumulation of evidence suggested not isolated incidents but a pattern, a systematic collection of travelers who had, like him, refused the toll and found themselves unable to complete their passage. The pain in his joints had progressed beyond ache to a sensation of active dissolution, as though the connections that held his skeleton together were being systematically dismantled. His fingers no longer bent at their customary angles. His elbows articulated in ways that made him avoid looking at his arms. His hips produced grinding sounds when he walked that suggested bone scraping against bone, though the sensation felt less like damage and more like reconfiguration, like pieces being rearranged according to some blueprint he hadn't consented to and couldn't comprehend. The figures in the fog had drawn closer, close enough now that he could occasionally glimpse details, a hand that terminated in fingers too long and too numerous, a face that appeared normal until it shifted slightly, revealing that the features weren't quite aligned, that the eyes sat at different heights, that the mouth opened vertically rather than horizontally. They still didn't speak, still didn't acknowledge his attempts at interaction, but their proximity had changed from escort to confinement, from observers to guards ensuring he didn't deviate from the prescribed path. He'd begun to notice that the road was breathing. The observation arrived fully formed, without the gradual realization that normally precedes such insights. The gravel beneath his feet rose and fell in a gentle rhythm that matched no rhythm in nature. Not the wind, not his own breathing, not the pulse he could feel weakening in his throat. The road inhaled, pulling slightly at his boots as though trying to draw him down to its surface. Then exhaled, pushing up against his soles in what felt obscenely like a caress. This respiration was subtle enough that he'd initially mistaken it for the natural unevenness of walking on loose stone, but once recognized, it became impossible to ignore, impossible to attribute to anything but the road's own autonomous function. His sense of direction had abandoned him entirely. The road curved and switchbacked in patterns he couldn't track, yet he somehow knew he was still ascending, still climbing deeper into mountains that had become less geographic features than states of being. Up ceased to mean elevation and became instead a direction away from everything comprehensible, everything safe. He had no idea how long he'd been walking. The fog had erased time as thoroughly as it had erased space. But his legs continued their automatic motion even as the muscles began to fail, even as his thighs trembled, and his calves seized with cramps that dropped him to his knees. From his knees he could see the road more clearly, could observe details previously obscured by distance and perspective. The gravel wasn't uniform as it should have been, as it had appeared from the standing height. Each stone possessed unique characteristics. This one had a texture too smooth, like skin rather than stone. That one had a color too deliberate, too intentional. Another bore markings that resembled not the random scratching of geological processes, but something closer to writing, to symbols carved with intention. When he looked at these symbols directly, they slipped away from focus, becoming mere cracks and shadows. When he looked away, they reasserted themselves in his peripheral vision, insisting on their significance. He forced himself upright, using his hands to push off from the road surface, and found that his palms had left impressions in the gravel. Not depressions from pressure, but actual hand-shaped indentations, as though the road surface had been soft, pliable, willing to accept his touch and retain its memory. When he lifted his hands, the impressions remained for several seconds before slowly filling in, the stones flowing like liquid to erase the evidence of his contact. The temperature had dropped to a degree that should have been fatal. His breath no longer merely clouded the air, but seemed to freeze instantly into tiny crystalline structures that caught what little light the fog permitted and shattered into rainbow fragments before dissolving. His exposed skin, his face, his hands, had gone beyond numb to a state where sensation had inverted, where the absence of feeling had become its own kind of feeling, a negative impression that communicated wrongness more effectively than pain. When he touched his face again, the fingers encountered skin so cold it felt hot, a paradox that his nervous system couldn't properly process, and so translated into a shrieking alarm that he ignored because he had no choice, because stopping was not an option the road would permit. The cabin materialized from the fog without warning, without transition. One moment he walked through undifferentiated gray. The next, a structure stood before him, so close he nearly collided with its rough-hewn logs. It was small, a single room, perhaps 12 feet square, with a stone chimney from which no smoke emerged, and a door that hung slightly ajar, as though recently opened or perpetually welcoming. A single window glowed with warm yellow light that seemed impossible in this place, that seemed to violate every principle the fog had established. He approached the door on legs that no longer functioned properly, that bent and straightened according to their own logic rather than his conscious command. His hand, and he had to look at it to confirm it was still his hand, still possessed the basic architecture of a human hand despite the wrongness of its movement, reached for the door handle, which was simply a leather strap nailed to the wood. When his fingers closed around the strap, he felt a shock of recognition run through him. A sensation that this exact gesture had been performed countless times before, that this door had been opened by innumerable hands in his exact position, his exact state of deterioration. The door swung inward on leather hinges that produced no sound. The interior was exactly what a cabin interior should be. Rough plank floor, a cast iron stove radiating heat that felt like salvation, a rope bed in one corner covered with quilts whose pattern spoke of age and careful preservation, A simple wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves holding jars of preserved food, and basic utensils. The normalcy of it struck him as more disturbing than the fog's impossibilities, more wrong than the road's malevolent consciousness. This room was too perfect in its rustic simplicity, too precisely what he needed it to be, and that precision felt like a trap designed specifically for him, for his desperation, for his willingness to ignore evidence in exchange for heat and rest. The old woman sat in one of the chairs, though he hadn't seen her when he first entered, though the room was too small for her to have been anywhere but plainly visible. She was ancient in a way that transcended mere age. Her face collapsed into wrinkles so deep they created geography. Her hands gnarled like tree roots, her eyes roomy yet containing something that suggested they saw more, not less, than younger eyes. She wore clothing that might have been fashionable in some previous century, or might simply have been what was practical for mountain living. A long skirt of heavy wool, a blouse buttoned to the throat, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the stove's heat. She studied him with those disconcertingly acute eyes, her gaze traveling from his face to his hands to his legs, cataloging the damage with what appeared to be professional assessment. When she spoke, her voice came from somewhere deeper than her throat, resonating in a register that seemed to bypass his ears and communicate directly with his bones. You didn't pay the toll. It wasn't a question. He tried to deny it anyway, and tried to lie, but found that his mouth wouldn't form the necessary words. His jaw worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to produce a simple, defeated affirmative sound that she accepted with a nod. She rose from her chair with surprising fluidity for someone so ancient, crossed to the stove, and ladled water from a kettle into a tin cup that she pressed into his hands. The cup was warm. He clutched it as though it were the last solid object in a dissolving world. The water tasted of minerals and distance, of underground rivers and stones that had never seen sunlight. And when it reached his stomach, it created a sensation of temporary solidity, as though his interior had been given permission to coalesce briefly before the continued process of its dispersal. "Drink," she said, and he drank, draining the cup and accepting another that she filled without comment. The water helped, though he understood it was merely delaying rather than reversing what had been set in motion when he'd accelerated past the shrine without stopping. She returned to her chair and gestured for him to sit in the other. He lowered himself carefully, his joints producing their symphony of pops and cracks, and found that sitting increased rather than alleviated his discomfort. The chair was solid, real, ordinary, which meant his body's contact with it emphasized how he'd become none of those things, how his substance had been called into question and found lacking. "The legend is older than the words used to tell it," she began without preamble, her eyes fixed on something beyond the cabin's walls, beyond the fog, perhaps beyond the mountains themselves. Older than this settlement, older than the nations that claimed this land before the current one. The road exists because it chooses to. His spine produced a sound like a branch snapping in half, the vertebrae separating and realigning themselves in a configuration that made him arch backward in the chair, his head nearly touching the floor behind him before the spasm released him and he collapsed forward onto the table. She waited without apparent concern until his breathing steadied. "Your pelvis is flattening," she observed with clinical precision. "That's the road learning your dimensions. It needs to know what space you occupy before it can occupy you." She took a clay pipe from a pocket in her skirt and packed it with tobacco from a leather pouch, not lighting it but holding it unlit in her mouth as she continued. The old ones called it way spirit, path that walks, the linear hunter. It doesn't hunt by chasing. It hunts by being what you need to use, then learning you didn't ask permission. His hands shook badly enough that water sloshed from the cup. She reached across and steadied it, her fingers cold and dry against his. The toll isn't payment for passage. It's acknowledgement. A penny, a flower, anything that says, I know you're not merely ground. I know I'm traveling through you, not on you. He managed a single word, barely audible. Why? Why does it need acknowledgement? She drew on the unlit pipe. Why do you need your name spoken to feel real? Same reason. Everything that exists wants to be recognized as existing. His jaw had begun to dislocate, the mandible loosening in its socket. He felt it shift when he tried to speak again, felt it settling into a position that had nothing to do with human speech. By refusing to pay, she said, watching this transformation without flinching, you announced yourself as unclaimed, as available. The road doesn't experience anger. It experiences opportunity. She leaned forward, and now her voice dropped to something almost gentle, almost kind. It's a skinwalker, but not in the way the stories usually tell it. It doesn't steal skins. It is a skin, worn by something that exists in more dimensions than you can see. The road form is how it manifests here. For centuries, it's been content with this shape. But all things tire of their forms. All things seek renewal. His ribs had begun to separate, fanning outward like the slats of a blind. Through his shirt, he could see the flesh between them, becoming translucent, could see deeper structures that resembled neither bone nor organ, but something that had no name in human anatomy. As the surface preparing, she said, noting his horrified gaze downward, you'll need to be flat. Roads don't have depth the way bodies do. Please, he tried to say, but the word emerged as a sound like gravel shifting. The sickness you're feeling isn't disease, she continued. Relentless now. Perhaps understanding that mercy lay in finishing the explanation before he lost the capacity to comprehend it. It's evacuation. The road is leaving its old form, moving into you. You declared yourself empty and unclaimed, and it accepted your offer. The cup fell from his hands, hitting the floor, but not breaking, rolling in a slow circle that eventually brought it to rest against the table leg. And then, unbidden and unwelcome, a memory surfaced with such clarity it struck him like a fist to the sternum. His daughter, at 7 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, holding up a drawing she'd made of the two of them, holding hands under a crayon sun. This is us, Daddy, she'd said. And he'd been too busy, too distracted, had smiled and nodded and gone back to whatever had seemed important at the time. Whatever job or grievance or small catastrophe had occupied his attention. He couldn't remember what it had been. He could only remember her face falling slightly when he'd turned away, the drawing drifting down to the table where it had stayed for weeks before disappearing. Probably thrown away when he'd moved on to the next apartment, the next failure, the next retreat. She would be 17 now, nearly grown. He didn't know where she lived, what she looked like, whether she still drew pictures or whether he'd killed that in her along with everything else. He would never know. He would become something that couldn't know, couldn't remember in any way that mattered, couldn't hold the shape of her face in whatever passed for consciousness in a strip of mountain road. No, he whispered, and meant it. Meant it with something that might have been the first genuine feeling he'd experienced in years. No, I can't. But his body had already begun to flatten, to spread, his protest dissolving into sounds that had no human shape. And the old woman simply watched with her ancient, pitying eyes. You invited it to fill you when you had nothing left to lose, she said quietly. But you're remembering now what you've already lost, aren't you? Too late. Always too late? He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only sit and feel the truth of her words resonating with what his body had been telling him for hours, for miles, for the entire journey since he'd passed the shrine without stopping. "How long?" he managed finally, the words emerging as barely a whisper. She shook her head slowly. "The transformation completes when it completes. Hours, perhaps less. It depends on how thoroughly you've let go of yourself, how little you have left to cling to. Those who come here with attachments, with purposes, with reasons to resist, they sometimes last days. But you..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He understood what she saw when she looked at him, a man who'd been evacuating himself long before the road began its work. A man who'd systematically severed every connection, abandoned every responsibility, fled from every relationship until he'd become precisely what he'd feared most: empty, anchorless, a void waiting to be filled by whatever had the will to occupy him. The sensation of his skin loosening had accelerated during her explanation, as though the road, the entity, the consciousness, the thing that wore geography as its form, had decided that understanding its nature constituted permission to proceed without restraint. He could feel his face sagging, the flesh losing its mooring to the bone, beginning to slide down his skull, like wax melting in stages. His hands looked wrong when he raised them to his face, the fingers too long or too short or simply arranged, according to principles his eyes couldn't correctly interpret. "The others," he said, thinking of the artifacts scattered along the road, the evidence of terminated journeys. "Did they all..." "Most paid the toll," she said. "Most travelers do, even if they think it's foolishness. Even if they roll their eyes as they drop a quarter in the bowl. Enough residual superstition remains in most people to make them cautious. But every year, a few refuse. Every year, the road claims its renewal. You're not the first. You won't be the last." She rose again and crossed to the window, looking out into the fog with an expression that might have been sadness, or might simply have been the acknowledgement of patterns too large and too old to evoke emotional response. "When it's complete," she said without turning, "when you become what you're becoming, I'll know. The road will be gone. The path will vanish from where it's always been, leaving only forest and stone. For a time, weeks, perhaps months, travelers will find themselves unable to locate this route, will discover that their maps no longer match the terrain, that what was here is relocated. And then, gradually, you'll manifest. You'll become visible as a path, as a road, as the newest form of the linear hunter. And travelers will use you, will drive and walk along your surface, never knowing that you were once a man who refused the toll." He tried to stand, to protest, to deny this future. But his legs no longer answered his commands with anything resembling precision. When he pushed himself upright, his left leg bent backward at the knee, the joint reversing its articulation with a sound like wood splitting. He didn't fall because falling required a relationship with gravity he no longer possessed. Instead, he simply settled, his body folding in on itself in ways that should have been impossible, that should have broken him, but instead merely rearranged him, preparing him for his new configuration. The old woman turned from the window and regarded him with what might have been compassion. "It won't hurt," she said. "Not once the transformation completes. You'll lose the capacity for pain when you lose the capacity for everything else that made you human. You'll forget what it was to walk upright, to speak, to think in the linear fashion your species finds natural. You'll become something that exists across distance rather than through time, something that is all of its length simultaneously rather than a point moving through space. The road doesn't suffer. The road simply is." His vision had begun to fragment, to separate into layers that showed him multiple perspectives simultaneously. He could see the cabin's interior from his position at the table. He could also see it from above, as though he'd risen to the ceiling. He could see it from outside, through the window, looking in at his own deteriorating form. These perspectives didn't conflict or contradict. They simply coexisted, showing him what it meant to be something that existed in more than 3 dimensions, that perceived space as humans, perceived time as a landscape through which consciousness moves in ways that cannot be mapped by conventional geometry. The old woman's form had begun to multiply as well, or perhaps he was seeing her across the duration of her existence, young and old simultaneously, living and dead, present and absent. She was opening the door to let him in, and also watching him arrive, and also preparing to witness his departure. All these moments stacked atop each other like transparencies, creating a composite image that contained her entire relationship with this cabin, this road, this moment. "Why do you stay here?" he tried to ask, but the words emerged wrong, arranged in patterns that followed syntax he'd never learned, that belonged to languages no human spoke. She understood anyway, or perhaps she'd been asked this question enough times that she knew it was coming, that she had the answer prepared and waiting. "Someone must witness," she said. "Someone must remember, even if the memory does no good, even if it changes nothing. I'm the keeper of this threshold, the one who explains what cannot be changed, who offers comfort that is not really comfort to those who discover too late what they've offered and to what they've offered it. It's not kindness, it's simply function. The road requires a witness, and I've been that witness longer than you can imagine." His body had begun to flatten, to spread, to extend itself along dimensions he couldn't name. His legs were merging, becoming something that resembled not limbs, but a surface, a substrate. His arms had already lost definition, were now simply extensions of his torso, which itself had ceased to maintain boundaries, was flowing outward in all directions, seeking its final configuration. The pain had indeed vanished, replaced by a sensation he had no words for, a feeling of rightness in wrongness, of becoming what he'd always been destined to become, of fulfilling a purpose he'd never consented to but couldn't now refuse. The old woman had moved back to the window, was looking out into the fog with an expression of waiting, of patience cultivated across more years than a human lifetime should contain. "It's starting," she said, though whether to him or to herself or to the entity claiming him he couldn't determine. He wanted to ask what was starting, but found he no longer had a mouth positioned to form questions, no longer had a throat capable of producing sound in frequencies humans could hear. His consciousness was diffusing, spreading out across the growing expanse of himself, becoming less a point of awareness and more a field, a distributed network of perception that extended along what he was becoming rather than residing in a single location. The cabin's walls were becoming translucent, or perhaps he was developing the ability to perceive through them, to see the forest beyond. The fog slowly dissipating now that it had completed its function, the mountains reasserting themselves in their customary solidity. The road where he'd walked, where he'd suffered the gradual dissolution of his humanity, was fading, becoming less visible with each moment, its substance transferring into him as he became its substance as the exchange reached completion. He could see it clearly now, could understand what was happening with the strange clarity that came from existing across multiple perspectives simultaneously. The road was being erased from the landscape, its gravel flowing away, its contours smoothing back into natural mountainside, leaving only the faintest suggestion of where it had been, a ghost of a path that would fade entirely within hours. The trees that had leaned away from it were straightening, reclaiming the space it had occupied, and the animals that had lined its borders were dissolving back into ordinary wildlife, released from whatever force had warped them into their temporary configurations. And as the old road vanished, he felt himself manifesting, felt his new form taking shape according to principles he'd never studied but somehow comprehended, felt himself becoming a path, a route, a way through the mountains that hadn't existed moments before but now seemed to have always been here, seemed to belong to this landscape with the inevitability of geological features shaped across millennia rather than minutes. The last coherent thought he had as himself, as Garrett Miller, human, male, 43 years old, 3 states and 2 wives and 1 daughter behind him, was that the old woman had been wrong about one thing. He wouldn't forget what it was to be human. That memory would remain, would become part of his new existence, would color his consciousness as he lay across the mountainside waiting for travelers to use him for passage. He would remember walking on 2 legs, remember the warmth of human contact he'd spent his life fleeing, remember the small kindnesses he'd rejected, and the connections he'd severed, and the emptiness he'd cultivated until it became his defining characteristic. And he would use that memory. He would use it to recognize the travelers who came to him bitter and broken, who drove or walked along his surface carrying the same emptiness he'd carried, who approached his beginning, where there would soon stand a hand-painted sign reading, "Pay the toll," where a small shrine would materialize containing a wooden bowl waiting for offerings, and who would, in their cynicism or desperation or simple refusal to acknowledge anything larger than themselves, pass by without stopping, without offering, without the basic gesture of reciprocity that defined participation in the world. And when they did, he would know them. He would recognize them as his own kind, as vessels waiting to be filled, as those who had already evacuated themselves and simply hadn't yet realized it. He would claim them not with anger or malice, but with the same inevitability that had claimed him, the same recognition of emptiness calling to emptiness, of void seeking void. The old woman turned from the window and looked at the space where he'd been sitting, where his body had completed its transformation and vanished into his new configuration. The chair stood empty. The cabin held only her and the slowly cooling stove and the silence that follows transformation. She crossed to the door and stepped outside, looking down the mountain slope where the old road had been, seeing in its place the pristine forest it had interrupted for longer than history recorded. Then she looked in the other direction, toward where the new road had begun to manifest, and saw its beginning already clear and distinct, a gravel path that wound down the mountain toward the highway below, looking exactly as a mountain road should look, unremarkable and ordinary and perfectly designed to welcome travelers seeking passage through these peaks. At its beginning, just where it diverged from the paved highway, a fresh sign had appeared, its white paint still wet, its letters formed by an unpracticed hand that had allowed the paint to run slightly, creating the impression of melting a weeping. "Pay the toll," it read. Below the sign, a cairn of stacked stones had materialized, topped with a wooden bowl that contained nothing yet, that waited with patient emptiness for its first offering. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned back to her cabin, knowing that in days or weeks or months, another traveler would come, would see that sign, would make their choice. And if they chose wrong, if they refused the toll and drove past the shrine without stopping, she would hear them eventually, would hear their knock at her door in the deep hours when the fog rolled in and the mountains held their breath. She would let them in. She would give them water. She would explain what they'd done and what it meant and what they were becoming. She would witness their transformation because someone had to witness, because the road required it, because this was her function and had been for longer than she could remember. The door closed behind her with a soft click of latch-meeting wood, leaving the new road to complete its manifestation in solitude, to settle into its place in the landscape as though it had always been there, as though it would always be there, waiting for the travelers who would come, who would always come, who would drive or walk along its surface, never knowing that it remembered being human, that it carried that memory like a stone in its center, like a toll already paid that could never be refunded. Story 3. The cicadas began their screaming at dusk and would not stop until dawn. Ray had listened to them every summer of his life and knew their rhythms the way a man knows his own pulse. Tonight they sounded different, urgent, as if they too understood what was coming. He sat in the truck cab for a long time before going into the shed. The property was 5 acres of pine and scrub oak. The nearest neighbor 2 miles down a dirt road that washed out every spring. He'd bought it with cash 12 years ago from a man who asked no questions. The deed was filed under a name that wasn't his. The taxes were paid from a post office box in Biloxi. The utility company had no record of service here. The well was hand-dug. The septic system was a hole in the ground. No one came here. No one knew it existed. He'd made sure of that. The shed was corrugated steel over a concrete pad he'd poured himself, working through a week of 100-degree days, mixing and pouring and smoothing until the surface was level enough to hose clean. The steel walls held the heat like an oven. In summer, the temperature inside could reach 130 degrees. Good for the chemistry. The heat accelerated the breakdown, kept the solution active, prevented the fat from solidifying into a waxy mass that would clog the drains. He got out of the truck and stood in the yard listening. Frogs in the drainage ditch. An owl somewhere in the pines. The cicadas. No human sound for miles. He unlocked the shed door and pulled the cord for the overhead light. A single bulb, 60 watts, hung from a rafter on a length of chain. The shadows it cast pooled in the corners where the concrete met the walls, and in those shadows there moved nothing but the memory of things that had once held the shape of men. The drums stood in a row against the far wall, 5 of them. Blue poly barrels stamped with the manufacturer's mark and a warning about chemical storage. He'd bought them from a farm supply store in Alabama, paid cash, gave a name he'd made up. Beneath the stamps was the crusted residue of previous work, white and alkaline, like salt deposits. Each drum held 55 gallons. He never filled them past 3/4. Too much displacement when you added the body parts. The solution would overflow, and you'd have evidence on the floor, evidence that could seep into the concrete, evidence that could last for years. He'd learned that the hard way. He moved to the workbench and began his preparation. This was the ritual, the same every time. First, the protective gear. Rubber apron, heavy gloves that went past the elbow, safety goggles with a seal around the eyes, then the tools. He laid them out in order on a square of oilcloth, left to right, the sequence he would use them. Reciprocating saw, boning knife, cleaver, fillet knife worn thin from sharpening. Each blade had been cleaned after the last job, but he inspected them anyway, holding them up to the light, checking for any microscopic residue that might cause rust or corrosion. The chemistry required precision. The tools required maintenance. These were the disciplines that separated him from Travis. Travis was chaos. Travis was impulse and rage and violence that bloomed without warning. Travis made messes. Ray cleaned them up. He'd been doing it for 20 years, and in that time he'd learned things the books didn't teach you. That sodium hydroxide worked best at a pH of 14. That water temperature mattered. Too cold, and the reaction was sluggish, too hot, and it produced gases that could build pressure and blow the lid. That bones took longer than soft tissue. The teeth needed to be removed first and crushed separately and scattered in different locations because enamel resisted the base solution. That a human body, reduced to its component elements, weighed about 5 pounds, mostly calcium phosphate, some sodium salts, trace minerals, nothing that couldn't be washed down a drain or buried in the woods where the soil would absorb it, nothing that could testify. He removed the gloves and apron and hung them on their hooks. Not yet. First, there was the matter of preparation, of readiness. A man didn't start this kind of work without making certain his mind was clear, his hands were steady, his purpose was pure. He went to the corner where he kept a metal footlocker. Inside was a bottle of whiskey, half empty, and beside it, a photograph. He took out the photograph and looked at it in the light from the overhead bulb. 2 boys, standing in front of a lake. The younger one was grinning at the camera, his arms slung around the older one's shoulders. The older one was smiling too, but his smile was smaller, more careful. The smile of someone who understood that moments like this were temporary. Behind them, the water was dark and still. The photograph was 21 years old. The edges were worn from handling. The emulsion was cracked in places from being carried in a wallet, then a pocket, then stored in this shed where the heat and humidity worked on it slowly, the way the chemistry worked on bodies. Travis had been 18 in this picture. Ray had been 22. They'd gone fishing that day, caught nothing, drank beer from a cooler they'd packed with ice. It was the last good day they'd had together. 2 weeks later, Travis would do his first stint in Parchman. Ray put the photograph back and closed the footlocker and stood in the silence of the shed. His forearms were already showing the red patches from this morning's work, small chemical burns like brands. When he rolled up his sleeves, he could count them. Dozens of them in various stages of healing, some fresh and weeping, others scabbed, others already scarred. The oldest ones were white and smooth, the skin beneath them thinner than normal, almost translucent. Each mark was a body. Each body was a job. Each job was Travis needing him. He'd lost count years ago. The work was necessary. He had known this for 20 years. But tonight something felt different. Tonight the weight of it pressed on him in a way it hadn't before, as if the gravity in the shed had increased, as if the air itself had thickened. He moved to the drums and checked them one by one. The plastic sheeting was intact. The solution levels were correct. The pH strips he dipped into each drum showed 14. Optimal. Everything was ready. Everything except him. But he didn't move toward the door yet. He stood at the workbench with his hands flat on the scarred wood and tried to make himself ready for what came next. This one was different. He'd known it from the moment he got the call. Travis's voice on the phone had been wrong. Too calm. Too measured. The manic edge that usually lived in it was gone, replaced by something flat and cold. I need you to come get something. The usual place. That was all. No explanation. No apology. No promise that this would be the last time. Ray had known his brother all his life, and he'd learned to read the silences between his words. This silence said that something had changed, that they'd crossed the line they couldn't uncross. The kills were getting bad. Unapproved targets. Wrong people. The liquor store clerk 2 weeks ago had just been a kid, 17, maybe 18, working a summer job. Travis said the kid had looked at him wrong. Ray had cleaned that one up, dissolved it, made it disappear, but he'd felt something break inside himself while he did it. Some last barrier between necessity and atrocity. Then the woman in the parking lot, middle-aged, coming out of a grocery store with bags in both hands. Travis said she'd reminded him of their mother. Ray didn't ask what that meant, didn't want to know. He'd picked up the body at midnight behind an abandoned warehouse and driven it back here and done the work, And afterward, he'd sat in the truck bed and dry-heaved until his ribs ached. The Dixie Mafia was talking. Ray had heard it through the usual channels, whispers in the right bars, conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. They were going to do something about Travis, the wild dog that had turned rabid, the liability that threatened the whole operation. Ray could let them do it, could step back and let the organization handle it the way they handled all problems. Quick, efficient, a body that would never be found. But they were talking about his brother. He'd made a decision 3 days ago. Sitting in his apartment at 2 a.m, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, looking at that same photograph of 2 boys by a lake, he'd made the only decision he could make. He would do it himself. Would put Travis down clean. Would make it quick. Would give him that much dignity. Then he would dispose of the body the way he'd disposed of all the others. Would render his brother down to calcium and salts. Would wash him away and scatter the remains and make sure nothing was left that could be found or identified or mourned. It was the last act of protection he could offer. He went outside. The cicadas were deafening now, their bodies hidden in the live oaks that ringed the property. Their song rising and falling in waves that seemed to originate from the earth itself. The truck sat in the dirt yard with its tailgate down. In the bed was a blue tarp wrapped around something man-shaped, and the tarp was tied with yellow nylon rope. And where the rope crossed and knotted, there were dark stains. Ray stood looking at it. The night air was thick with humidity and the smell of the swamp half a mile to the south. That ancient reek of decay and fecundity, of things growing and things rotting in the same black water. Mosquitoes found him, and he did not slap them away. He stood very still. Somewhere in the middle distance, a heron called out, its voice sharp and prehistoric. He had done this before, many times. The count he no longer kept had stopped keeping years ago when the numbers began to mean something other than what they should mean. Each one was Travis. Each one was the work of saving his brother from himself, from the violence that lived in him like a sickness, like something inherited through the blood. The boy had always been wild. Even as a child, there had been something in him that could not be tamed, some fundamental absence of the mechanism that kept other men from crossing certain lines. Their father had beaten it into him, and their mother had prayed over it, and neither had made any difference. By the time that Travis was 16, he'd done his first stint in Parchman for aggravated assault. The man he'd beaten had lost an eye. Travis had shown no remorse. But Ray had stayed with him, had visited him in prison, had been there when he got out, had kept him close because that's what brothers did. You didn't eat an abandoned family. You didn't let them drift into the current alone. When the Dixie Mafia found Travis, it was almost a relief. They gave his violence a purpose, a channel. They made him an enforcer, and they paid him, and Ray watched from a distance and told himself it was better this way. Better that Travis work for someone than work for nothing, than hurt people for the simple reason that he could. Then the killings started getting bad. Unapproved targets, wrong people. A liquor store clerk who'd said something Travis didn't like. A woman in a parking lot who'd looked at him the wrong way. The scenes were becoming grotesque, theatrical. Travis was no longer just violent, he was creative with it, and the Dixie Mafia didn't tolerate creativity. They tolerated efficiency. They tolerated discretion. What they did not tolerate was a rabid dog that might turn on its handler. So Ray had made himself useful. He'd studied, learned chemistry from library books, practiced on deer carcasses in the woods, perfected the timing and the mixture until nothing remained but a greasy residue that could be washed down a drain. He'd positioned himself as the cleanup man, the one who made Travis's mistakes disappear, and for a time it had worked. But now there were too many mistakes. The frequency had increased. 3 bodies in the last 2 weeks. The organization was talking. Ray had heard the whispers. They were going to do something about Travis. They were going to put him down like the animal he'd become. Unless Ray did it first. He reached into the truck bed and gripped the tarp. The fabric was stiff with dried blood. He pulled and the body rolled slightly, a dead weight that moved with the horrible looseness of all dead things. He dragged it to the edge of the tailgate and let it drop. It hit the ground with a sound like a sack of wet sand, and Ray stood over it, breathing hard. The cicada screamed. He bent and took hold of the rope, began dragging the body toward the shed. The tarp caught on roots and rocks, and he had to stop twice to work it free. By the time he reached the shed door, his shirt was soaked through with sweat, and the chemical burns on his forearms were weeping clear fluid. Inside, he positioned the body beneath the hanging bulb. He unknotted the rope, his fingers stiff and clumsy, and peeled back the tarp. The face that looked up at him was not his brother's face. He stepped back, looked again. A stranger, 40, maybe 50 years old, thinning hair combed to one side, a mustache going gray at the edges, ordinary features, forgettable. The kind of face you'd pass on the street and never remember. But the throat. The throat had been cut with such force that the wound gaped obscenely, the edges clean and purposeful. Professional work. A single draw across the carotid left to right, deep enough to sever the artery but controlled enough to avoid the spine. The kind of work Travis had perfected over the years. Ray stood over the body trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He'd come to collect Travis, the body of his brother. The mercy killing he'd planned for 3 days, the final act of protection. But this was someone else. He turned in a slow circle, looking at the shed as if the walls might explain. The drums stood in their row. The workbench held his tools. The concrete floor showed the familiar stains and discolorations from years of use. Everything was where it should be. Everything except what lay at his feet. He tried to reconstruct the sequence. The phone call had come this morning. He remembered that clearly. Travis's voice. "I need you to come get something." Not a usual place. The abandoned gas station off Highway 61. He'd driven there. Remembered driving. The truck's engine making that ticking sound it made when it was hot. The way the steering wheel felt under his hands. The turn onto the access road. Then the memory fractured. Became pieces that wouldn't fit together. He was at the gas station. He was walking around the building. He was looking at the truck. The tarp was already in the bed. The body already wrapped. The rope already tied. But he didn't remember doing any of those things. Didn't remember wrapping the body. Didn't remember tying the knots. Didn't remember putting it in the truck. A note. There had been a note on the windshield. He reached into his pocket with shaking hands and found it, unfolded it, held it under the light. "Clean this up. I'll call you." The handwriting stopped him. He knew Travis's handwriting, had seen it his entire life. Birthday cards with misspelled words. Letters from parchment on that thin paper they gave you. The note he'd left, once explaining where he'd hidden the money from a job. All caps. The letters crowded and angular, like someone who'd never quite learned cursive, who'd been failed by the school system, who wrote the way he spoke, blunt and direct and barely contained. This handwriting was different. Neat, controlled. The letters evenly spaced with gentle curves. Adult handwriting, educated handwriting. He looked at it for a long time before he understood. The handwriting was his own. He'd written this note to himself, from himself, pretending to be Travis. His hand began to shake and the note fluttered to the floor. Something was wrong. something fundamental. But his mind wouldn't let him look at it directly. Every time he tried to focus on the wrongness, it slipped away like water through his fingers. He knelt beside the body, made himself look closely. The man's clothes were ordinary, jeans stiff with work and wear, a flannel shirt, green and black checks, work boots that had been resoled at least once. On his left hand was a wedding ring, the gold worn thin from decades of wear, the inside surface polished smooth. Ray's hands moved without a conscious thought, patting down the pockets. Front left, nothing. Front right, a handful of change. Back pockets, a wallet. He opened it with fingers that felt numb. Driver's license. Dennis Wayne Hoyt. Date of birth, March 17th, 1978. Address on Maple Street in Gulfport. In the photograph on the license, the man was smiling slightly, the way people smiled for DMV cameras when they were trying to look presentable but not too happy. In the billfold section were 3 $20 bills neatly folded. A Walmart receipt for groceries dated 2 days ago. A business card for a plumbing company. And tucked behind the bills, a photograph. 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old, standing in front of a Christmas tree. The boy was missing his front teeth. The girl wore glasses and a red sweater with a reindeer on it. They had their arms around each other, and they were smiling, and behind them you could see wrapped presents in a woman's legs, someone standing just out of frame. Ray stared at the photograph until it blurred. This man had children, had gone to Walmart 2 days ago and bought groceries, had worn his wedding ring for so long it had worn smooth, had been alive 47 years, and now he was dead on the floor of Ray's shed with his throat cut, and Ray could not remember doing it. He set the wallet carefully on the concrete. His hands were shaking badly now. He looked at them, turned them over. Under the fingernails was dark residue, dried blood. He'd washed his hands. Must have washed them, but hadn't gotten everything. Small crescents of crimson under each nail. He stood and moved to the workbench. The boning knife lay where he'd set it before going outside. The blade gleamed under the overhead light. Clean, or apparently clean. But when he picked it up and the handle felt sticky, he brought it close to his face, squinted at the place where the blade met the handle. In the gap between them was a thin line of something dark, blood that had run down the blade and collected there, drying in the seam where running water couldn't reach it. He'd washed this knife, had a clear memory of washing it. Standing at the pump outside, working the handle, the water gushing cold and clear, scrubbing the blade with his hands, watching the water turn red, then pink, then clear again. But the memory felt distant, thin, like something he'd watched happen to someone else through a window. He set the knife down carefully. The footlocker. He moved to the corner and opened it. Inside were clothes, his clothes. An extra set he kept here in case. In case what? He couldn't remember. Couldn't remember why he kept clothes here or when he'd started doing it. He lifted out the shirt. Gray cotton, work shirt. And across the front were stains, fine droplets scattered in a pattern he recognized from 20 years of cleanup work. Arterial spray. The kind that came when you cut a throat at close range, when you were standing in front of the victim, when the pressure of the beating heart sent blood outward in an arc of fine droplets. He held the shirt up to the light, and the pattern was perfect, unmistakable. The spray had originated from his right side, about chest height, from someone standing in front of him, from Dennis Hoyt's throat. But he hadn't been wearing this shirt. He was wearing a different shirt right now, blue denim, work shirt, clean. Or was it? He looked down at himself, at his sleeves, at his chest. The shirt was clean, but when he lifted his left sleeve, he saw blood on the cuff. Just a smear, barely visible. The kind of mark you'd get if you wiped your hand on your sleeve without thinking. He dropped the shirt from the footlocker, lifted out the jeans. More blood. A large stain on the right knee, dark and stiff. The kind of stain you'd get if you knelt beside a body while it was still bleeding, while you waited for the heart to stop pumping, while you made sure the job was done. Under the clothes in the footlocker was something else. Something he'd forgotten was there. A tape recorder. Small, digital. The kind you could buy at any office supply store. He picked it up, and the weight of it felt familiar in his hand. He'd held this before, used it before, but he couldn't remember why. There was a tape inside. He could see it through the plastic window. His thumb found the play button, pressed it. Static for a few seconds, then a voice. His voice. Ray, listen to me. You need to know something. He stopped the tape. His heart was hammering. That was his voice, but he didn't remember recording it. Didn't remember ever owning a tape recorder. He pressed play again. You're going to wake up soon, and you're not going to remember. You never remember. So I'm leaving this for you. For after. A pause. The sound of breathing. His breathing. There is no Travis. There hasn't been for 20 years. Travis died in the swamp. The gator took him. You know this. Somewhere you know this. The tape hissed. He could hear something in the background. The cicadas. This had been recorded here in this shed. But you can't accept it. Your mind broke when he died, and it created something to protect you. It created Travis. A version of him that was still alive. Still getting into trouble. Still needing you. His legs felt weak. He sat down on the floor, the recorder still playing in his hand. And when you couldn't save him, when the guilt became too much, you started creating situations where you could save him. You go into fugue states, hours at a time, sometimes days. And during those times, you become him. You do the things he would do. The violence, the killing. No? Then you come back. You wake up, and there's a body. And your mind tells you that Travis did this, that Travis called you. That Travis needs you to clean it up, and you believe it because you need to believe it. No. I am recording this during a moment of clarity. I don't know how long it will last, but I need you to know the truth. We killed this man, Dennis Hoyt. We picked him at random at a gas station this morning. We followed him to his work. We waited for him to leave. We did this. And the tape clicked off. Ray sat in the silence that followed. The recorder was heavy in his hand. He wanted to throw it, wanted to smash it. Wanted to destroy this evidence of what? The truth? He looked at the body on the floor. At Dennis Hoyt with his wedding ring and his children and his life that had ended because some part of Ray that he couldn't control had decided it should end. There was no Travis. The knowledge settled over him like a weight, like the concrete pad beneath him, heavy and cold and undeniable. The knowledge came to him not as revelation, but as something he had always known and had spent 20 years refusing to see. A wall in his mind that had held firm for 2 decades and was now crumbling, and behind the wall was the truth. Travis had died in the swamp when Ray was 23 and Travis was 19. They had been running shine for a man named Bodie Pierce, small-time operation, just enough to keep them in beer money. The boat they'd been using was a flat-bottomed skiff with an outboard motor that ran rough. They'd loaded it with mason jars and pushed off into the black water, and Travis had been laughing about something, some girl he'd been with, and he hadn't been watching where he put his feet. The boat had tipped. Not much. Just enough. Travis went over the side, still laughing, and the water closed over his head, and when he came up, he was screaming. The gator took him under before Ray could reach him. The water thrashed and went still, and Travis never surfaced again. They found what was left of him 3 days later, hung up in the roots of a cypress tree 2 miles downstream. Ray had identified the body. He'd stood in the coroner's office and looked at what the swamp had made of his brother, and he'd said, yes, that's him, that's Travis. Then he'd gone home and put a gun in his mouth, and the gun had clicked empty because he'd forgotten to load it. And he'd sat on the floor of his apartment and wept until there was nothing left inside him. When he woke up the next morning, Travis was alive again. Not in the flesh, in his mind. A voice that spoke to him, that called him on the phone, that left him notes and got into trouble that Ray had to fix. Travis, the enforcer. Travis, the killer. Travis, the brother who needed protecting. And Ray had protected him. Had created an entire architecture of delusion to house his guilt and his grief. Had committed murders in a fugue state, his consciousness fracturing. One part of him doing the killing, while another part watched from a distance and believed it was someone else's work. Then he would wake up to the aftermath, the body, the blood, and his mind would construct the narrative it needed. Travis had done this. Travis needed him. Ray had to clean up the mess. The disposal work was real. The chemistry was real. The bodies dissolved into soap and minerals and were washed away. But there was no Travis to save. There never had been. How many had there been? How many Dennis Hoyts with wallets full of photos of children who would never see their father again? He tried to count, but the numbers wouldn't come. The memories were fragmented, scattered across 2 decades like broken glass. He thought of the man on the floor, tried to remember killing him and couldn't. Tried to remember the moment when his hand had gripped the knife and drawn it across the throat and couldn't. That part of him was locked away behind a door he had no key for. But he remembered afterward. Remembered standing over the body in an empty parking lot somewhere, his hand shaking, the knife wet in his grip. Remembered the satisfaction, the sense of purpose. Then the fog, the transition, the moment when one self receded and the other came forward. The protector, the cleaner. Ray, who loved his brother. Ray, who would do anything to keep Travis safe. In the corner of the shed, something moved. He turned his head. Nothing there. Just shadows. But he could feel it. A presence. The shape of his brother as he'd last seen him alive, 19 years old, his hair wet from the swamp water, his mouth open in a scream that had never ended. The cicadas fell silent all at once. The suddenness of it was like a physical pressure, a weight settling over the shed. In the silence, he could hear his own breathing, ragged and fast. Could hear the drip of something in the corner where the drum stood. Could hear the blood moving through his veins. He got to his feet. His legs were unsteady. He moved to the workbench and picked up the boning knife. The handle fit his palm perfectly, worn smooth by use. How many times had he held this knife? How many throats had it opened? He looked at the body on the floor. Dennis Hoyt. Father, someone's husband. Someone who had left his house that morning not knowing he would never return. And Ray had taken that from him. Not Travis. Ray. The knife was heavy in his hand. He could end it now. Could open his own throat the way he'd opened Dennis Hoyt's. The chemistry would work on him, too. Give it enough time and there would be nothing left. No body to identify, no questions to answer. Just another disappearance in a state full of disappearances. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. The same mechanism that had fractured his mind, that had created Travis and sustained the delusion for 20 years, would not permit him to destroy himself. Self-preservation ran deeper than truth. He set the knife down. The work still needed to be done. Dennis Hoyt still needed to disappear. It didn't matter anymore why or how he died. What mattered was that the body could not be found, could not be traced back to anything. He stood and tried to make himself move toward the drums, tried to begin the process he'd performed so many times. It should have been automatic, but his body wouldn't respond. His hands hung at his sides, useless. The tape recorder sat on the floor where he'd dropped it, his own voice still echoing in his mind. There is no Travis. 20 years. 20 years of bodies. 20 years of chemistry. 20 years of protecting a ghost. The smell hit him then. Wrong. Different from the usual chemical smell. Something organic and foul underneath the sodium hydroxide. Something that shouldn't be there. He turned toward the drums. The first one looked normal. The blue lid sealed tight, the barrel sitting level on the concrete. But the second drum, the lid was slightly askew. Not much. Just a degree or two off-center. And around the base of the drum was a spreading pool of something thick and gray-brown. He moved closer. The smell grew stronger. Not just chemical now, but rot. Decay. A sweet, sick smell of decomposition. His hands shook as he reached for the lid of the first drum. When he lifted it, the smell that rose up made him stagger back. The solution inside had turned cloudy, viscous. A thick layer of waxy substance floated on the surface, but beneath it, he could see shapes. Recognizable shapes. A hand, the fingers curled. Part of a rib cage, the bones still connected by cartilage. A section of skull with hair still attached, floating just beneath the surface like some awful buoy. The chemistry had failed. Or he had failed. Had mixed it wrong. Had been too distracted, too fractured, too broken to maintain the precision and the work required. He moved to the second drum. The lid was easier to remove. It had already been forced partway off by internal pressure. When he looked inside, he saw the same thing. Incomplete dissolution. Body parts still identifiable. Evidence. Everything he'd spent 20 years making disappear, now visible and present and condemning. The third drum, the fourth, the fifth, all of them the same. The solution had become saturated, overwhelmed. Too many bodies, too much mass. The chemistry couldn't keep up with the killing. How long had it been like this? Days? Weeks? How many times had he sealed these drums, thinking the work was done, thinking the evidence was destroyed, while underneath the solution they were accumulating, while the proof of his murders was growing, multiplying, waiting to be discovered? He stood in the center of the shed, surrounded by his failing work, and felt something break inside him that could not be repaired. The delusion had sustained him. The belief that he was protecting Travis had given him purpose. But the work, the actual chemistry, the disposal, the precision, that had been real. That had been the one true thing he'd built with his own hands, his craft, his competence. The thing that made him more than just a killer. And now even that was gone. The drums had betrayed him. Or he had betrayed himself. It no longer mattered which. He walked outside and stood in the yard. Dawn was coming. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. The cicadas were screaming. They had been screaming all night. They would scream forever. His truck sat in the dirt with its tailgate still down. His tools sat in the shed. The photograph of two boys by a lake sat in the footlocker. All of it meaningless now. All of it just props in a story that had ended the moment Travis went over the side of that boat 20 years ago. Everything since had been epilogue. He took out his phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. He dialed 911 and held it to his ear and waited for someone to answer. And when they did, he gave them the address. Told them what they would find. Told them to bring a large team. Told them there were bodies. Then he hung up and walked outside and sat down in the dirt yard with his back against the truck and waited. The cicadas were screaming again. Or maybe they had never stopped. Maybe they had been screaming for 20 years and he was only now hearing them. He looked at his hands, the chemical burns, the blood under his nails, the hands that had held the knife, that had done the cutting, that had mixed the solutions and disposed of the evidence. These were his hands, not Travis's. His. In the distance, he could hear sirens. Faint, but growing louder. They would be here in minutes. Then there would be questions he couldn't answer, and evidence he couldn't hide, and a reckoning he couldn't escape. He thought about running, about starting the truck and driving away before they arrived, but he was tired. So tired. The weight of 20 years was pressing down on him, and he could not carry it anymore. So he sat and waited and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. The shed behind him sat silent. The drums inside continued their slow work. The chemistry proceeding according to its laws, breaking down protein and fat, dissolving bone, making soap from flesh. The process would continue whether Ray was there to oversee it or not. The caustic solution did not care about guilt or innocence. It did not care about brothers or delusions or the lies men told themselves to survive. It only cared about the chemistry. And the chemistry was simple. You added the base, and you added the body, and you waited, and what came out the other end was nothing. Clean, pure. Gone. The sirens were close now. He could see the flashing lights through the trees. Ray closed his eyes and listened to the cicadas, and waited for the police to arrive and arrest him for the murders he had committed in the name of a brother who had been dead for 20 years. When they asked him why, he would tell them the truth. All of it. The boat, the swamp, the gator, the guilt, the fracture, the fugue states, the delusion. And they would not believe him. They would think he was lying, making up an insanity defense, trying to escape responsibility for what he had done. But he wasn't lying. This was the truth. And the truth was stranger and more horrible than any lie he could have invented. The truth was that he had created a monster so he wouldn't have to admit he was one. The truth was that he had killed these people to save a ghost. The truth was that the ghost was himself. The squad cars pulled into the yard and the doors opened, and officers got out with their guns drawn, and they were shouting at him to get on the ground and put his hands behind his head. He did as they asked. The dirt was warm against his cheek. His arms were pulled behind him, and the cuffs went on, and they were tight, too tight. And the metal bit into the chemical burns on his wrists. They lifted him to his feet and walked him to one of the squad cars and put him in the back seat, and someone was reading him his rights, and he nodded to show he understood, even though the words meant nothing. Through the window, he watched as more vehicles arrived. Crime scene technicians, a medical examiner, more police. They moved around the yard like ants, purposeful and efficient. Someone found the shed and opened the door, and he saw them recoil from what was inside. One of them turned away and vomited into the dirt. Ray looked away. He didn't need to see. He knew what was in there, knew what they would find, knew that from this moment forward his life would be defined by those drums and their contents. The car started moving. They were taking him to the station, to be processed or photographed, fingerprinted, to be locked in a cell while they collected evidence and built their case. He watched the shed recede through the rear window, watched it grow smaller and smaller until it was just a shape against the trees, and then it was gone. But the cicadas followed him. He could still hear them, would always hear them. The sound of the Mississippi summer, the sound of his brother's last scream, the sound of his own mind breaking, the sound that had been there all along, waiting for him to finally listen. Story 4. Sophie woke in the chair beside Nina's bed and couldn't remember falling asleep. Couldn't remember the last time she'd actually slept, if what happened in the chair could even be called sleep. The room was full of morning light, but she had no sense of morning, no feeling that one day had ended and another begun. Time had become a substance she moved through without measuring, thick and resistant as water. Nina lay peaceful in the hospital bed, her face smooth and unchanged. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, 68 beats per minute, and the same as yesterday, and the same as every day for the past 6 weeks. Sophie's neck ached from the angle she'd slept at. She straightened slowly, her vertebrae crackling, and reached for her coffee cup on the side table. The coffee was cold. She didn't remember pouring it. The Spode cup, circa 1820, Emari pattern, found at an estate sale in Tucson, sat there as evidence of actions she couldn't recall taking. This happened more and more. Entire segments of time would simply vanish, leaving her disoriented, grasping for continuity. She would be in the kitchen and then standing in Nina's room with no memory of crossing the distance. Would find dishes in the sink she didn't remember using. Would discover locks checked and rechecked with no recollection of her hands on the deadbolts. The neurologist had used the word dissociation. Sophie had nodded as though she understood, as though the word explained anything at all about how it felt to live inside a mind that had stopped recording properly. She set down the cold coffee and looked at her sister. Really looked, though looking had become a kind of faith exercise. She searched Nina's face for signs of consciousness the way someone might search the sky for proof of God, desperately, despite mounting evidence of absence. The house had always been full of broken things. That's what they did, she and Nina. Restoration work. Antiques. Their grandmother had taught them the trade, how to read the grain of damaged wood, how to coax frozen mechanisms back to life, how to make invisible repairs that honored the original craftsman's intent. The workshop behind the house held all their tools, though Sophie hadn't opened that door since the night of the attack. Couldn't bring herself to cross that threshold where Nina had fallen, where the man in the black mask had been standing over her with the tire iron. No, not fallen. That wasn't right. Nina hadn't died there. Sophie knew this. Nina had been in the hospital for 2 weeks. The ICU. Machines breathing for her. Doctors using words like catastrophic and irreversible. Sophie pressed her fingers against her temples. Sometimes the timeline felt slippery, events rearranging themselves when she wasn't paying attention. She would remember Nina dying at the bottom of the stairs and then catch herself. No, that wasn't what happened. Nina had died in the hospital while Sophie was in the cafeteria, while Sophie was doing something as ordinary as drinking bad coffee from a paper cup. The death certificate said April 18th. The funeral had been April 22nd. Today was... Sophie looked at the calendar on the wall and felt something cold move through her chest. June 3rd. 6 weeks. Nearly 7. How had it been 7 weeks? She looked back at Nina, at the peaceful face, at the rise and fall of breathing that seemed so real, so present. Their grandmother had taught them in the workshop behind the house, the same workshop where Sophie and Nina eventually built their business. Gran had been a woman of few words, but infinite patience. She would set a broken thing in front of them, a chair with a missing spindle, a table with water-stained veneer, and wait. Never explained what needed doing, just waited for them to see it for themselves. Nina had been better at this, the seeing. She had a way of tilting her head and going still, as though listening to something only she could hear. Then her hands would move with certainty, selecting the right tool, the right approach, as if the object itself was telling her what it needed. Sophie learned through analysis, through understanding the mechanics of construction, in applying logic to deconstruction. But Nina simply knew. "You're thinking too hard," Nina would say, watching Sophie puzzle over some problem. "The piece wants to be whole again. Listen to what it's telling you." Sophie would laugh and call her mystical, but she envied that intuition and that confidence. Nina moved through the world with a sureness Sophie had never quite achieved. Even as children, when Sophie would hesitate at the top of the diving board or the edge of a dare, Nina would already be mid-leap, laughing at the rush of it. Their grandmother died when they were 24. Left them the house, the workshop, everything. The funeral was small. Afterward, they had stood in the empty workshop, surrounded by her tools, her unfinished projects, and neither of them had known what to say. Finally, Nina picked up Gran's favorite chisel, the one with the worn oak handle, and set it deliberately back in its place on the pegboard. "We keep going," she had said. Not a question. Sophie had nodded, and they had. 8 years of keeping going, building a business from Gran's reputation and their own growing skill, learning to source pieces, to negotiate with dealers and collectors, to recognize what was worth saving and what was kindly left to decay. They developed a rhythm. Nina handled the delicate work, gilding, inlay, anything requiring a light touch. Sophie did the structural repairs, the refinishing, the invisible mending that made a piece whole again. They never talked about whether it was enough, this life they'd built. Whether either of them wanted something different. Marriage, maybe. Children. A career that didn't involve spending hours alone with sawdust and silence. The question never arose because the answer was always evident in the way Nina would hand Sophie a tool without being asked. The way they could work opposite ends of a table and know without looking that the other was doing it right. That was before the man in the black mask. Before the night that shattered everything they had built and proved that some damage runs too deep for repair. Now Sophie sat in the kitchen of the house they had shared, watching morning light creep across the countertop like something guilty, and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in restoration. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. She didn't know when. Time had become unreliable lately. A mechanism with stripped gears, skipping forward in lurches while she tried to hold on to the present moment. She had poured the coffee at 7:30. The microwave clock had read 7:30. Now it read 9:47. 2 hours and 17 minutes had passed while Sophie sat motionless at the kitchen table, and she couldn't account for any of it. Her mind circled through the possibilities. Had she checked the locks? She must have. She always checked the locks in the morning. 3 times each. Doors, windows, the gate to the backyard, but she had no memory of doing it today. She stood and walked through the house, testing each lock with hands that shook slightly. All secure. So she had checked them. She simply didn't remember checking them. This was happening more frequently. Entire segments of the day would vanish, leaving only gaps and the unsettling certainty that she must have been doing something during those missing hours, even if she couldn't recall what. The neurologist she'd seen 3 weeks ago had been concerned about this. A young man with kind eyes who clearly found her alarming. He'd asked about her sleep schedule with careful casualness, as though the answer didn't particularly matter. Sophie had lied. Said she was sleeping fine. 5-6 hours a night, perfectly adequate. The truth was, she didn't know if she slept anymore. She would lower herself into the chair beside Nina's bed around midnight, telling herself she'd rest for just an hour. Then the room would be full of daylight, and her neck would ache, and she'd realize she had no memory of the intervening time. Whether she'd slept or simply sat with her eyes closed in some fugue state, she couldn't say. Dreams and waking had bled together into something indistinguishable. The neurologist had suggested gently that caring for a coma patient at home might be too much for one person. That perhaps the rehabilitation facility had been more appropriate than Sophie wanted to admit. He hadn't quite said that she was falling apart, but the implication had settled between them like something physical. Sophie had smiled and thanked him and left without scheduling a follow-up appointment. The doctors didn't understand. None of them understood. Nina needed to be home, in the house they'd shared since they were 24, surrounded by the things they had restored together. The Edwardian settee they'd reupholstered in sage velvet, the Art Nouveau mirror they'd resilvered, the rosewood secretary desk that had been their first real commission. These objects held them both. The work of their hands, the hours of shared silence. Taking Nina away from this would be like cutting her loose from her own history. Sophie moved through the house now, testing locks she'd already tested, and found herself in the workshop doorway. She hadn't opened this door since the attack. Couldn't bring herself to. The workshop was where it had started, where the man in the mask had broken the lock on the back door, where Nina had gone to investigate the sound in the middle of the night while Sophie was still stumbling out of sleep upstairs. By the time Sophie reached the top of the stairs, Nina was at the bottom, not moving, blood pooling beneath her head in a spreading darkness that looked black in the dim light. The man had been standing over her, tire iron in his hands, black ski mask covering his face. Sophie remembered screaming, remembered throwing herself down the stairs at him, all reason consumed by rage and terror. He'd been stronger, had caught her by the throat and thrown her into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster, hard enough that she saw a white light and tasted copper. When her vision cleared, he was gone, the back door swinging open, Nina's blood on the threshold. Sophie stood in the workshop doorway now, not crossing it, and stared at the space where Nina had fallen. The bloodstain was long gone. The police had been thorough, but Sophie could still see it, dark and terrible, spreading across the floorboards. Could still see Nina's face turned at that wrong angle, her eyes open but not seeing. She had thought Nina was dead, had been certain of it. The ambulance ride was a blur of noise and motion, and someone's hand on her shoulder. The emergency room, fluorescent and pitiless. The doctor's careful, neutral expression as he explained about traumatic brain injury, about induced coma, about uncertain outcomes, and the importance of managing expectations. Nina wasn't dead. Not yet. She was alive. The machines proved it. Heart rate, blood oxygen, brain activity. All present. All functioning. For 2 weeks, Sophie lived at the hospital, slept in the chair beside Nina's bed, learned the rhythms of the ICU, the language of monitors and ventilators. The doctors spoke in careful terms about brain swelling, about response to stimuli, about the narrowing window for a meaningful recovery. Sophie heard them but didn't believe them. Nina would wake up. She just needed time. Sophie made plans during those 2 weeks, researched home care protocols, called medical supply companies about hospital beds and oxygen equipment, contacted visiting nurse agencies. The social worker encouraged this, thinking Sophie was preparing for Nina's eventual discharge and rehabilitation. No one questioned her determination to bring Nina home. It seemed like hope, like love. On the 14th day, Nina's brain swelling increased catastrophically. The neurologist explained with terrible gentleness that they were losing her, that the damage was irreversible, that Sophie needed to consider letting her go. Sophie had refused, insisted they keep trying. But Nina died anyway, slipped away while Sophie was in the cafeteria forcing down coffee she didn't want. By the time Sophie returned to the room, Nina was gone. Just a body in a bed, machines still beeping out of habit, nurses standing awkwardly in the doorway with their practiced sympathy. The funeral happened in a haze. Sophie remembered standing beside the grave, but felt separate from her body, watching herself from a distance. People spoke to her. She must have responded. Someone drove her home. She found herself in the empty house with no memory of the journey. The next day, she called the medical supply company, the hospital bed she'd ordered 2 weeks ago. Back when Nina was alive, back when bringing her home seemed like planning rather than delusion, was ready for delivery. Did she still want it? Sophie said yes. The bed arrived on a Tuesday. The visiting nurse agency called to confirm their first appointment. Also scheduled during those 2 weeks at the hospital when Sophie had been preparing for Nina's homecoming. Sophie confirmed. Said yes. Nina was home now. Yes, they were managing. Yes, the appointment time worked fine. The mannequin arrived on Wednesday. Sophie had found it through a medical training supply catalog while researching home care equipment. She'd told herself she was just looking, just preparing for Nina's recovery, just being thorough. But she'd ordered it. Had paid for expedited shipping. Had given them the delivery date, 2 days after Nina's funeral. Some part of her had known even then, even while Nina was still technically alive. Some part of her had been building the escape route before she consciously knew she'd need it. Sophie dressed the mannequin in Nina's favorite nightgown, the one from the hospital. The nurses had given it to her with Nina's other belongings in a plastic bag that Sophie hadn't been able to open until now. She positioned the mannequin in the hospital bed and attached it to the oxygen equipment. The visiting nurse was coming Friday. Everything needed to be ready. She stood back and looked at her work. It was good. Realistic. If you didn't look too closely. If you didn't want to look too closely. Nina was home. That's what mattered. Nina was home where she belonged, and Sophie would take care of her, and eventually she would wake up and everything would be like it was before. Sophie believed this, had to believe it. The alternative was standing in an empty house with a dead sister and no reason to keep breathing. The first visiting nurse arrived on Friday as scheduled. Looked at the mannequin in the bed, checked the machines, made notes. If she noticed anything wrong, she didn't say. Maybe she thought Nina's stillness was the depth of the coma. Maybe she was new and uncertain. Maybe Sophie's careful attention to detail. The feeding tube positioned just so, the blankets arranged to hide the joints, was enough to fool a cursory examination. Or maybe the nurse saw exactly what it was and didn't know how to address it. Didn't know the protocol for a caregiver whose grief had crossed into delusion. Made a note to discuss it with her supervisor and left without saying anything to Sophie directly. That first visit set the pattern. The nurses came and went. Some seemed to notice the wrongness, some didn't. But the appointments continued week after week because Sophie had set them up while Nina was alive and no one had officially canceled them and the system kept running on its own momentum. She closed the workshop door now and locked it, tested the lock, tested it again. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see into the living room where Nina lay in the hospital bed. They had moved the settee to make room for it, pushed the display case of porcelain figurines against the wall. The bed looked wrong among the antiques, too modern and metallic, like a surgical scar across familiar skin. But Sophie had insisted on bringing Nina home after 2 weeks in the rehabilitation facility. The doctors had argued, used words like appropriate care and medical supervision and unrealistic expectations. Sophie had signed the discharge papers anyway. Nina would want to be home. Sophie was certain of it, the way she was certain of very little else these days. She moved into the living room now and stood beside the bed, looking down at her sister's face. Nina appeared peaceful in sleep. The swelling around her eyes had subsided weeks ago. The skull fracture was healing. The neurologist had shown Sophie the latest scans, pointing to areas that meant nothing to her, explaining that the brain was showing some activity, that recovery was still possible, even if improbable, that they should maintain hope while being realistic. Sophie had stopped listening halfway through. She didn't need scans to know Nina was still in there. She could feel it. The same way Nina could feel what a broken object needed. Sophie could feel her sister's presence, damaged but not destroyed, waiting to be restored. The feeding tube snaked from Nina's nose to the IV stand. Sophie had learned to change the nutrition bags